Going live. Here we go. We're live, Paul. Happy
Hello,
New Year.
Happy New Year. We're live, don't swear.
It's our hello, everyone. It is our first live stream of 2024. Happy New Year to all of you. We are reading out loud the original proposal for Watchmen by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons, which is found on the back of a lot of Watchmen of newer Watchmen trade paperbacks. So if you have the older trade paperbacks, you probably don't have it, but I have it in the absolute edition. Paul, before we get to it, Watchmen, right? The common thing about Watchmen is that it started with a pitch for the Charlton characters, Blue Beetle, Captain Atom, etc. But I'd like to read this out to you from an interview with Alan from around 2003, where he says that I think that Dick Giordano had just acquired the Charlton characters. Either Dick himself suggested it, or Dave suggested it, Dave Gibbons suggested it, or I suggested it. I can't remember whose idea it was, but the idea was let's come up with a new treatment for the Charlton characters. Now, at this point, I remembered a vague story idea that I'd had floating through my mind for years. I knew that it would entail having a whole continuity's worth of superheroes. Not a large continuity's worth necessarily, but it would have to be several characters. And I'd originally, I think, come up with the idea as related to the Mighty Comics characters. I really wanted a sort of second string superheroes, if you like. I didn't want these iconic figures like Superman, Batman, and Captain America. I wanted more average superheroes like the Mighty Crusaders line. I think I had some vague idea that it would be quite interesting to take a group of innocent, happy go lucky superheroes, like, say, the Archie comic superheroes, and suddenly drop them into a realistic, incredible world. I think my original idea had started with the dead body of the Shield being pulled out of a river somewhere, and this sort of sparking a kind of murder mystery plot. Paul, are you familiar with the Archie comic superheroes?
Vaguely, yes, yes. I remember Impact Comics from the 90s, and that was the Archie heroes, wasn't it?
So let me just share my screen really quick. So for anyone who is not familiar with the Archie comic superheroes, I just want you all to know that. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Yeah. These guys originated as these guys.
So
uh
taking like happy, bright, innocent superheroes and turning them into something darker, I mean, that idea is never going to catch on, is it, really? I mean, who'd want to do that, you know?
Absolutely not. Even Pixar would never do it.
No.
Now, I think this one is interesting, partly because this dude in green is named the Hangman. So
Oh,
I feel like Hooded Justice himself has a very, very clear line to the Archie comic superheroes. Everyone else kind of, you know, kind of generic.
yeah. I mean, that guy in yellow, that's literally Kirby's Sandman costume, isn't it?
I think his name is Bob Phantom.
Oh
Uh,
wow, that's good. I like that more like Alan Superman or something.
I'll also point out that this guy in front, the Shield, predates Joe Simon and Jack Kirby's Captain America by
Wow.
like a year. And then I think in the 70s, he was remade into he had like a legacy character named Lancelot Strong the Shield, who was created by Jack Kirby.
Wow. Who's the
um
Batman Black Panther guy?
I think he's called the Fox.
Oh wow.
Seriously, I feel like a bunch of these, not just Archie comic superheroes, but I feel like a bunch of Golden Age comics that weren't DC, Marvel, or Fawcett basically just took out a dictionary and came up with something.
Yeah.
Uh, but of course, he had this idea in the back of his head using these characters, and then when the DC acquired the Charlton characters, they created a pitch using these characters, which eventually would be reworked into all new characters, except for Judo Master. And I don't know why, but and that is the pitch we will be reading today. Okay.
Cool.
All right, Paul. Are you ready? I figure we'll
I'm
do the
ready.
same thing that we did for Twilight, which is let's just go side by side, alternating paragraphs.
Lovely.
All right. You want to start, or I could start?
No, I don't mind kicking off if you want.
Here we go.
Cool. So imagine I'm Alan Moore.
I'm not going to try that, but okay.
I'm not going to do the voice, but imagine I'm Alan Moore. Big beard, misunderstood. We'll start from the outside of the concept and work inwards, beginning with the world that these characters inhabit. For a start, as I said over the phone, I think we should not even think for a moment which Earth this thing is set on, and make no attempt to tie it in with regular DC continuity. If you ever do want to do a Captain Atom / Superman crossover, then I suppose you could always do it as a special event in its own right, like the X-Men / Titans crossover or something. Anyway, I don't think that the opportunity for casual crossovers is a good enough reason to include this in the DC multiverse when weighed against the drawbacks of such a move and the limitations imposed. For one thing, I'd like the world that the Charlton characters exist into be at once far more realistic in conception than any superhero's world has been before, and at the same time, far different to our own world than the worlds presented as Earth 1, Earth 2, or Marvel Earth. To see what I'm trying to get at, you have to try and imagine what the presence of superheroes would actually do to the world, both politically and psychologically.
Hey, Paul.
Yeah.
What do you think about the drawbacks of such a move, such as including this in the multiverse of DC Comics?
What's funny about this is that even back when Alan Moore was pitching this and he was really up for like Watchmen t-shirts, Watchmen board games, Watchmen whatever, the first thing he said was, I don't think you should cross over with the DC universe. That would be rubbish.
It's literally the first thing in the proposal. It's the first thing. And in case anyone is wondering, in case anyone has come to this party late and is wondering if you're kidding about him wanting Watchmen t-shirts and Watchmen merchandise and everything, he did work on a Watchmen RPG. So that does exist. But I love it. It's reasons.
So the other thing that I love as well, I don't love it, kind of makes me laugh, is that the thing about just imagine, superheroes in our world, what would that do to people politically and psychologically? And I was thinking the other day, actually, about when Kick-Ass was first announced. And I remember Mark Miller kind of pretending that he was the first one who had ever done this revolutionary idea of putting superheroes in the real world and seeing what happens, And this is literally the core of Watchmen. That's what Watchmen is, the most famous comic in the world. And that's what it does,
I'm going to go ahead and say that it's a little on brand for Mr. Miller.
I think you might be right there.
The Incredibles did it first, Mr. Miller.
Yes, well, this is it for a start. Yeah.
But I mean, I feel like Watchmen was the natural evolution of the superhero comic, right? Because even the Marvel age of comics was doing that to superhero comics.
Yeah.
From what superhero comics was at the time.
Yeah.
So it's just all an evolution. I do think that. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, even Alan Moore had done it before with Miracle Man.
Even Alan Moore had done it before with Miracle Man. There's all this talk about how Watchmen was beaten to it by Squadron Supreme. Watchmen is better, people.
Oh yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
And I feel like people were trying to do it in the 70s.
Mm,
There was just a lot of restrictions. I do think the dirty little secret to Moore's whole career is that he was allowed to get away with a lot of things that a lot of his predecessors weren't allowed to get away with.
yeah, yeah,
But part of that is because he earned it.
yeah, yeah. He did,
Okay.
and that's what the time was as well. That's what comics DC were a bit more experimental then, weren't they?
That's true. That's
Bit
true.
less
Especially,
cautious, maybe. You know.
yeah, I mean, it was the 80s. They were really trying to push the envelope. They were blowing up their universe. It's what happens. All
Yeah.
right. Imagine, for the sake of argument, that Captain Atom was one of the first heroes with actual superpowers to appear on the world we're dealing with. Before him, there had perhaps been a couple of non powered adventurers: Judo Master during the Second World War, and the original Blue Beetle at around about the same time. But he was the first one to actually possess abilities far beyond those that were believed to be scientifically possible at the time of his origin in the early 60s. What would his appearance do to the world psychologically? The actual manifestation of a real being with powers similar to a god. Would there be widespread feelings of inadequacy in people who had suddenly realized that even if they did their best and became the best long distance runner in the world, Captain Atom was always going to be faster and stronger and cleverer? I don't know about cleverer. Or would there be a sudden blossoming of crank religious groups who worshipped superheroes? How would the media respond to such an attractive and presentable image? Would they try to buy the rights from superheroes to the manufacture of dolls and lunchboxes in their image? Would religion be altered by the sudden, inarguable presence of a demonstrably real superior being? Uh, I'm surprised that there's not, for all of that talk about that, there's not much religion talk in the actual end product.
There's not, is there? No. I'm trying to think actually if we do see anything like that, and I don't think we do we?
No,
Maybe
I
in
don't think we do.
passing. If we do, it's not a significant one, is it? Like people calling
Uh,
Dr. Manhattan blasphemous, people building up cults around Dr. Manhattan.
that's about it.
Hmm.
Um, we don't really see anything of the sort. Maybe because Dr. Manhattan is so steeped in science,
Yes, yeah, yeah.
uh, to the extent that, but I do feel that, do we even really see the whole widespread feelings of inadequacy thing?
I think it's there. There's the undercurrent there. I mean, the whole thing about Night Owl not being able to get it up. You know, I think that sort of feeds into that a bit. Like, and
Fair
there's that
point.
undercurrent of it. I think, definitely.
Fair point. Fair point. They definitely do the media thing, the media
Mm.
responding to the superheroes, and as well as the merchandising thing. Ozymandias is all over that.
Do
Yeah,
you
I
know
think I'm
what
surprised at
struck
the lack of
me?
religion. Yeah.
Sorry, yeah, what struck me when you were reading that then is that how much of that has gone into Lex Luthor over the year, or since then. Like the way DC tells stories like this with Superman now is through Lex Luthor. Those feelings of inadequacy, they're all kind of embodied in Lex Luthor.
Yeah.
Morrison picks up on that definitely in All Star Superman, but I think it goes right back to the mid '80s when Luthor was revamped. That sort of what's the point? How can I be the best man if Superman's there? So that's really interesting because it enhanced Luthor as a character.
To my point earlier, the Marvel Age of Comics was doing that with J. Jonah Jameson.
Of course, what am I thinking? There's actually a panel, isn't there? That Ditko Lee panel where he's standing there saying, like, what does that make me if Spider-Man's a hero? Yeah, yeah, of
I
course.
actually really don't like that panel. Uh,
Really? I love that panel. Wow.
like, I think it's a fine panel on its own. I just really hate how it spells it out right off the bat.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's not
It's
subtle, is it?
so blatant, so blatant. We have a comment from JDS, who I assume is JD Schaffner,
Hello.
saying, Hey guys, I'm lurking while at work and wanted to say quickly Happy New Year to you both and the Comics Cube. Happy New Year, JD.
Happy New Year.
Okay. You want to keep going?
Oh, giddy up. Let's have a look. Uh, where did you leave off? Demonstrably real superior being.
Yes.
Then there are the political aspects. Being honest for the moment, I think that if this country, England, had had a loyal member of the military with the abilities of Captain Atom, I think it's fair to say that our foreign policy would have perhaps been far less cautious. Being realistic, I think that in the real world, the government of America would be similarly inclined. Russian missiles, at least the majority of them, could be detonated in midair by a character like Captain Atom, working on the side of the Americans. Of course, Russia would still hold the final last-ditch option of all-out mutually assured destruction as a sort of feeble check upon any unwarranted American advances. But the balance of power in the world would be significantly different, and many historical events would have worked out differently. The war in Vietnam might very well have ended successfully from an American point of view if there had really been a Captain Atom. Countries owned by one side might very well be owned by the other in the sort of altered world that we're talking about.
Paul,
So
I'm just gonna record the call because I realized I haven't pressed that.
okay.
There we go. Okay. You were gonna say something.
Oh well, that happened, didn't it? The Vietnam War, changing, and we
Yeah.
definitely see politics changing in the Watchmen world.
One thing that I hate about this proposal as well as Watchmen is how you can say things like Russia would still hold the final last ditch option of all out mutually assured destruction and not know what year it is.
Yeah.
It's annoying. But yes, the Vietnam thing is very blatant. It's like I think when you talk about how different the world of Watchmen is to, the real world or the DC Earth or whatever, it's actually the first thing that comes to my mind. It's not the electric cars. It's not the fact that Indian food is so much more famous than, especially when you consider it was the 80s. It's not any of that. It's the fact that America won the Vietnam War.
Mm.
And it is the thing, the crux that turns everything around in my mind.
I mean, because it was like, yeah, that was such a scar on America, wasn't it, in the latter half of the 20th century, that it kind of infected everything. Like all pop culture was affected by that. Just stuff like Back to the Future, and that whole kind of Reaganite sort of looking back to the 50s when we were winners kind of thing, that all happened, and that's still going on now. That's still affecting us now, that sort of worldview that in the West, I mean,
Yeah.
that sort of aspect of pop culture. So you take that away or change that, and everything changes.
Everything absolutely changes. And I think that I never actually intellectualized why, when people think of the good old days, people think of the 50s, but I think you just explained it. It's because the 60s had Vietnam
Yeah,
and they lost.
yeah.
All right. You know
um,
what else? You know what else this reminds me of?
yeah.
Captain Atom uh could just detonate missiles midair in midair. Tangent.
Of Tangent Comics.
Yeah, the Tangent universe.
Yeah.
That's Dan Jurgens' Captain Atom.
Of
No,
course.
wait, not Atom. That's Dan Jurgens' The Atom,
The Atom. Yeah. Of course it is. Yeah. God.
who is
And
absolutely not Superman.
we saw a film. Well, you didn't, I don't think. I don't think a lot of people watched it actually, but I did. The Flash last year, where where a super character is literally detonating missiles in midair. I mean, one of the shots on the trailer is Supergirl flying into the missile and detonating it with her face. So again, like these ideas just sort of tossed up. Well, not tossed off, obviously well thought through, but these ideas that Alan Moore came up with in the 80s are still sort of permeating our pop culture in every way. Like,
just significantly less finesse Supergirl.
oh, absolutely.
Much like the rest of that movie. Okay.
Yeah, I think that's a whole podcast in itself, isn't it?
No, I would have to watch the movie to do that
Oh
podcast.
yeah, no, I wouldn't. I wouldn't inflict that on you.
All right, Paul.
It's you now, isn't it?
Is it? All right. Okay. I hope you see what I mean here. What I'd like to try to and do is to treat the world that the Charlton heroes live in exactly the same as our world, but to actually try to work out and follow through on the implications of the presence of superheroes. You can't do that in conventional superhero comics, partly because it would be too difficult to coordinate over more than a couple of books, and partly because I think there's still a feeling that if the world in the comics becomes too removed from the reality that the reader lives in, there will be no room for identification. Personally, I think this places far too much importance on the nebulous and unproven concept of reader identification and tends to ignore the success of Conan, Star Wars, Dungeons and Dragons, Tolkien, and any other entertainment set in a world different from our own. I think if the world is presented as interesting and fascinating and well conceived enough, then it will hold the reader's interest regardless of its differences to the world the reader lives in.
That's interesting.
That is interesting. What do you think of
Do you
that?
know what? I think he's coming from a very sort of British comics reader perspective there. In that he doesn't mention it, but things like, Judge Dredd that we grew up with over here is a world that obviously satirizes our own world, but isn't identifiable as our own world. And it's like, it doesn't surprise me that a British comic creator is perhaps less concerned with the world outside your window. But from personal preference, I certainly, and maybe this is a flaw in me as a consumer of this kind of media, but I like that I can recognize the world that Spidey is swinging around. I like that aspect of it.
I also think if you consider the fact of when he grew up, depictions of a place like New York, which every world outside your window is, it was not widespread. So to him, reading a Marvel comic or reading a DC comic with Metropolis, which is basically New York, or Gotham, which is basically New York, is as alien to him as anything else. Whereas when you and I were growing up, movies about New York or whatever were all over the place.
Yeah, that's true. That's true, actually. If you grow up in Northampton in the 60s, in the 60s, you might as well be in Mega City 1 if you set your character in New York, because this is futuristic wonderland, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, so one of my favorite cartoons is Gargoyles, and that's set in New York. And I think one of the first times I ever went to New York, I was like, hey, that's where that scene takes place. But it's not super widespread, even a few decades before we were born. So I mean, I get where he's coming from.
Do you think, and this isn't me, looking down my nose at Americans, because I want to emphasize that I personally like seeing superheroes in a recognizable world, but do you think it's an American thing to want that? To want to see the world outside your window in your pop culture?
I think there's a strong correlation.
Yeah. But again, I have to emphasize that's not me being snooty about Americans, at all.
It's hard for me to say because as a Filipino, I'm used to being not represented.
Yeah.
So, and I'm used to not seeing, the Philippines in anything other than a Filipino work. To the point where when I do see it in an international work, I'm like, oh, but it's not something that's a default for me. So it's not something that I can really speak to. I do think that let's take the MCU, right?
Mm.
So the MCU likes to show that it's the world outside your window, right? But with minimal changes. But with the blip that has completely changed.
Mm.
They cannot walk back from that at that point.
Yeah.
So I think it is, if you're telling a cohesive story of a universe, you're eventually going to have to you're gonna have those differences and it's just not gonna work. Like I think that the ending of Starman, where Ted Knight has given out the patents for all of his inventions, and he's he dies and he leaves behind all of his inventions. I think as much as you and I would like to see those inventions in the DC universe, it's never going to happen
No, no.
because it changes the whole universe.
Yeah.
And Lamar says hi.
Hello,
Hi,
Lamar.
Lamar. All right. Go ahead, Paul.
Okay. Right. I think a world that had actually lived with the presence of superheroes for 20 years would be a very interesting place. Firstly, as noted above, the balance of power would be completely different. And I should imagine that Russia would be growing increasingly frightened and restless as they watched the Western alliance growing in strength. The international situation, as an indirect result of this, would be very tense indeed, possibly even more so than today. If the doomsday clock in our own world stands at 5 minutes to 12, then in the world we're talking about, the big hand is just a fraction of a second away from midnight, a fact that I'll be referring to in a later part of the outline, and which is essential to the story I want to tell. Also, the
No
laws.
comments.
Oh,
That
yeah.
last line speaks for itself.
Yeah, where is the doomsday clock at the moment? Isn't it isn't it actually a fraction of a second away from midnight at the moment?
Oh my goodness. At this current point in time, the doomsday clock stands at 90 seconds to midnight.
And what
Oh
does
my,
Alamo think? He said it was 5 minutes away, did he, in the 80s when he was writing
said it
this?
was 5 minutes away in the 80s.
Oh, imagine that 5 minutes. He didn't know he was born, did he? 5 minutes.
Oh
Oh.
my God. Anyway, you were going to continue reading. And my only thing was like, all right, Jeff Johns definitely read this part. Okay.
Yes, absolutely. So, also, the laws would have to be changed to accommodate independent vigilante superheroes, which would, of course, alter the whole American legal system and lead to increased tension on the streets as the laws become more vague and uncertain and difficult to apply. Say the law makes allowances for 8 persons working independently towards the good of the community in an effort to let superheroes off the judicial hook. Wouldn't that open the door for, say, a black gang member to simply put on a mask and go out and beat up a few Chicanos who were threatening the good of his community? As the laws become more unworkable, the pressure on the ordinary cop up on the street would become far tougher. This would be coupled with a growing resentment of maverick superheroes usurping the police's authority and responsibility for the safety of society. How much of it would need to provoke a police strike? Would it need to provoke a police strike or total work stoppage in demand of a change in the law to make superheroes outlaws again? That's interesting, yeah, because that's something I never considered as a superhero fan, is that if superheroes were real, and they were working with the police, like Batman was always like a deputized
Yeah.
member of the law, wasn't he? It's like that would change everything, wouldn't it?
It would change everything. One of the reasons I never really think about it is because when I do think about it, the allegory falls apart. It's Civil War, right? Like
Mm.
Civil War, both the comic and the movie, they try to tackle these issues. They try to be realistic about it. They try to, be nuanced about it. But there's only so much that you can do that with a superhero genre without falling flat on your face.
Yeah.
So registering superheroes, right? Like, let's go back to this again. In any world, any sane person would be Team Iron Man. The only reason anyone is Team Captain America is because he's Captain fucking America. If anyone else was leading Team Captain America, you would not be Team Captain America. I guarantee it.
Well, I don't know, because again, but you think of the United States though, and the strong sort of libertarian streak in that country, I think a lot of them would be pro Captain America because the emphasis on individual liberty, and and just because, like, for example, it's such a sticking point. Gun laws are such a sticking point in the United States, and I would imagine it would be like the same thing. It's like, yes, the thing might destroy my taxi, but at the same time, if they come after the thing, they might come after me.
I think the difference is access. So, like, with gun laws, everybody has the ability to get a gun. Whereas with superpowers, it's like, well, I feel like it would trigger the whole part of their brain, which is like, well, I can't have it. I don't have it. So no one else should have it.
Again, there's this whole idea, and we do have it in Britain as well, this idea of the American dream, right? So people don't want the rich to be taxed, even though they're nowhere near being billionaires themselves, because they think, well, I could be a billionaire one day.
All right, that's fair.
You know what I mean? So it's like, I maybe a spider's going to bite me tomorrow, and I'll turn into Spider-Man. You never know.
See, JD says, I was Team Cap because I felt that waiting for permission to help people is kind of dumb. That's true, but if you were the people and the only person around to help you is the Hulk, you might. I'm just saying, you might want a little bit of moderation there. But also, like, when you talk about the laws being changed, so that happened in Watchmen in a very unilateral way, right? Like, it's just, they just outlawed all of them. And to highlight a whole trope in superhero comics, which is that cops are incompetent, they are unable in all of those years to capture Rorschach. It's not like Rorschach is good at his job. Read the book, people. He's not good at his job. He's not a good detective. He's not good at fighting. He's not. He loses every fight he's in. Like, he spends 10 issues trying to figure out who did it, and he can't. And Night Owl figures it out in like a page.
Yeah.
But no, all of those years they're unable to capture Rorschach. So, I don't know what he's trying to say. Like, I keep telling people that Alan Moore grew up in the 50s and the 60s. He grew up with Mad Magazine. And so making fun of things, satirizing things, it's just like the way he sees things, right? I don't know what he's trying to say. I don't know what Britain was like at the time in terms of the police and the law. I know it was Thatcher's Britain. You're probably better off talking about that than I am.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, like, I think, in the 70s and the 60s, 70s, and 80s, I mean, there was uproar everywhere, right? There was rioting and uproar everywhere. I mean, like, in the late 60s in France, for example, there were riots, weren't there? And
yeah.
So I don't think it's peculiar to America or anywhere. It's that kind of anti-establishment kind of attitude would have been kind of baked into someone who grew up in that era, I think.
Well, let me ask you this, right? Like, thinking about a comic that is set in New York, for the most part, written by a British guy and drawn by a British guy. As somebody from that part of the world, you're not English, but
Mm.
as somebody from that part of the world, Paul, do you see any British sensibilities in Watchmen?
Oh yeah, definitely. Because all this stuff we've been saying about individual liberty,
Yeah.
and the American dream and all that, like in the 80s, Thatcher loved that, and the individual, like she famously said, there's no such thing as society, she was all about the individual, and so as a reaction to that, I mean, I could definitely understand where Watchmen's coming from, and like the attitude of people like Alan Moore and Pat Mills, another British creator, have to the concept of superheroes, and we were just talking about Civil War there,
Yeah.
and we naturally came to this sort of right-wing version of superheroes, and it doesn't take much to scratch at the concept of superheroes before you've got this sort of right-wing fantasy, basically. And I'm saying this as a sort of left-wing person who loves superheroes, but it's there, it's part of the DNA of superheroes, I think.
It's true.
And yeah,
As a
so
left-wing person who loves superheroes, it is a genre where punching people wins.
yeah, and it's a
Right.
particular brand of right wing, this belief in the individual that Margaret Thatcher and her politics was, and her successors are all about. So I think it's it's a very big reaction to that, I think.
All right, let's continue. Uh, it's me, right? No, it's
Yes,
you.
yes.
Okay, yeah, it's me. Then, of course, there would be other social considerations. I imagine that for one thing, there would be an increase in paranoia and conspiracy theory if people didn't just have to worry about the KGB or the CIA or the Trilateral Commission or the Bavarian Illuminati or whatever, but also had to contend with the idea of utterly unknowable and alien beings who work entirely independently and probably secretly had all sorts of strange powers, enabling them to see through walls and keep tabs on people without detection. This could quite easily turn to some form of superhero related mental illness in some cases. Another example of superhero related neurotic behavior would be superhero groupies, probably of both genders. I could see some sections of the gay community deliberately going out of their way to commit crimes on a superhero's own turf in order to provoke a savage and superheroic beating that they could tell their friends about for years. Wow!
Just the gay community? What?
What?
Oh, 80s Alan
What?
Moore.
Oh my God! This is the part where we just remind people we're just reading the words of 1980s Alan Moore out loud. And these are the opinions and words of 1980s Alan Moore. You'd have to talk to 2023 Alan Moore to see if he still agrees with that.
And, I mean, in Alan's defense, he didn't write this with the idea that it was going to be in a hardback book available to everyone, being read out by two guys over the internet one day. I'm sure he would have considered his words a lot more carefully if, that was the intention. I don't know whether that is an adequate defense or not.
For context, as far as I know, at this point in time, he was living with his wife and somebody else and another woman in a throuple situation. But I've it's not just the gay community, Alan. Like, let's move on. I don't want to dwell on this.
So yeah, conspiracy theories though. We kind of see that a bit. Do we see that actually? in Watchmen?
I mean, there's the new frontiersman.
That's true. But I guess the whole thing about Watchmen is that all the conspiracy theorists are kind of right.
That's true.
Yeah.
But we don't really see groupies either.
No, well, there's like it's kind of played for laughs, isn't it? The joke about Rorschach throwing someone down an elevator shaft.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's one of the aspects of Watchmen that hasn't aged the best.
Rorschach throwing out someone on the elevator shaft.
Well, someone having, yeah, this whole idea of like
Yeah.
a fetish, laughing at people like with a fetish.
I mean,
Um,
I do believe that some of the more sexual components of 1980s Alan Moore's works don't age the best. I am
yeah.
thinking about the carnival and the killing joke.
Yes. Yeah.
Not
But
great.
yeah, yeah. So,
It's okay. It's okay. It was 40 years ago. Oops.
different time. That's what we say, isn't it? It's a
It's a
different
different time.
time.
You and I were very tiny people.
Yes.
All right.
All of the above is only concerned with the human reaction to superheroes. There would be a technological reaction. A character who can fly from one end of the galaxy to the other, like Captain Atom, could have gleaned as much information as 1,000 Voyager spacecraft in a tenth of the time, as well as provided vital help in other forms of scientific endeavor. This would have changed technology to some degree, and technology would have further changed the world. I could carry on at length about thousands of inconsequential or important differences that the presence of superior beings would make to our world, but I'm sure you get the idea. We have a very weird and unusual world presented totally realistically, and that world is hopefully interesting in itself. In many ways, rather than being about an individual superhero or a group of the same, this projected book is about their world and how they live in it and what the results of that might be. So, yeah, the technology aspect. Do you think that comes across in Watchmen in the end?
There's the electric cars.
Yeah, it's kind of touched
Yeah,
on. It's
I
more
feel
with
like it's
Ozymandias.
not. Yeah, it's more with Ozymandias, but I don't. I feel like it's not as explored as it could have been.
Mm, yeah.
This is the part where I share this part of the proposal, which is let me just share my screen. All right, can you see my screen?
Yes, I can.
All right, so this is I share this part of the proposal. These are notes by Dave Gibbons. I just want to say, even in a very, very quick sketch, you can see how good Dave Gibbons is.
Yeah.
Um, because once Moore did the proposal, Gibbons is the one who actually really thought out, the little details of the world. So he had a lot of stuff like the geodesic domes. So Ozymandias used that. The rear engine electric cars, lightweight polyacetylene batteries requiring rare lithium from manufacture, double-breasted suits, unusual fast foods, unusual fads and addictions, no disease. No disease. I guess that's true. No one in Watchmen is sick. Except blatantly for the cancer that is blamed on Dr. Manhattan. No poverty. I guess that's true too. Widespread feelings of inadequacy, lack of motivation, pirate, medieval, Western rather than science fiction movies, etc. Less sexual restraint. Airships. Do you remember airships?
Oh, I think there were airships in the background, weren't there? I can't remember.
I think
Tell
there
us in the
were.
comments.
Remind us.
Is there no poverty?
I don't think we see a poor person.
Well, Rorschach grows up in poverty, doesn't he?
Oh, that's true.
I guess that's
Yes.
potentially before Dr.
And
Manhattan, though, isn't it?
no, but the apartment that he lives in.
Yeah.
The apartment that he lives in. So yeah, so there is poverty. I do think it's kind of sad that one instance of poverty that we see somebody in a regretful sex work situation. I'm not
Mm,
judging sex work. I'm just saying that it does seem like this person regrets it. The character.
mm, mm.
Um, submarine freighters, Earth orbit in Antarctica, Antarctica rich kids holiday playground, and weather control.
Mm.
So those are their thoughts about that world, and I think that it's not. I think it's mostly in the background. I think one of the things that's great about Watchmen in terms of its world building is that there's a lot of stuff in the background that they don't really call attention to it.
Mm.
But also at the same time, I feel like it could have been paid more attention to. So the point is you just can't make me happy.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like that's it. You could have if you were to do spin-offs from Watchmen, you could ignore all the main characters, right? And just hang around in that world for a bit, like.
That's what it is.
Mm,
Like I could hang out around that little newsstand all day,
mm,
which which is where that newsstand is a crux, right? That's
yeah.
the newsstand is right there. The Gunga diner is on the other side. Rorschach's little trash can is somewhere in the middle. Um,
Like
so
Oscar the Grouch.
like Oscar the Grouch. But I do think that so we see the electric cars, we do see all of the stuff with Ozymandias. But the problem with most of the technological stuff being centered around Ozymandias is that there's a point in time where you think, because of our association with things like Batman or Doctor Doom or whatever, you just associate, oh, of course he's got high technology. You don't think of
Yeah,
it as the world. So
yeah,
really, it's just the electric cars.
yeah. Because like the geodesic dome is his evil hideout, right? So
Geodesic Dome's evil hideout.
yeah,
Um, the airship is just the owl ship is just Night Owl's ship.
yeah.
All right. The world will look different, feel different atmospherically, and behave differently in given situations, and the comic will be as much a chronicle of that as anything else. Of course, it will also have a number of characters as well, who I am just about to get to. At this point, I should ask you to bear in mind that there are large amounts of the details concerning the Charlton characters that I am simply unfamiliar with. There were hardly any comic shops over here in the 60s, and I had to rely entirely upon the incredibly spotty newsstand distribution. On top of this, I had foolishly bound all of my beloved Charlton material into a book and then lent it to someone who I never saw again. Okay, Alan's human. As a result, most of the character details that I have built upon below are based upon my unreliable memory, and I hope you'll forgive the inaccuracies. This is just a preliminary outline, and before I beat the thing finally into shape, I'll want to study whatever photostated Charlton material you can send me, both long and hard. The following should give you at least some idea, however, of the line of thought that I'll be following with these characters. We'll start with a big fish and work on from there. You
That's
want
a
to talk about
reminder,
that?
isn't it? Of well, sorry, I'll just say this. This is a reminder, isn't it, of how difficult it must have been back then? Because now we just look at Wikipedia,
Now it's
or
easy. It's so
yeah,
easy. And even in the 80s, right, you already made a leap with like Who's Who and the official handbook of the Marvel Universe.
mm,
Easier. But back then it's like I I don't know who Nightshade is. F if I know.
yeah,
Like I just know she's there.
yeah,
I forgot a
yeah.
judo master was in this. Um and a part of me is amused at the thought of thinking that the Charlton characters were just not so unmemorable
Mm,
that he still has the book. He just didn't
yeah,
want to reread it.
yeah.
I mean, honestly, Paul, have you tried reading old Charlton comics?
No, I think I read the first Peacemaker once, but I can't remember much about it. Oh no, I read the question. I read the first appearance of the question, and it's
Is it,
full Ditko, isn't it?
it's a nice way to put it. I was gonna
Yeah.
say it's terrible.
All these characters have these huge speech bubbles, and that like all of Ditko's thoughts and everything. Yeah.
Won't shut up. You want to talk about the character revisions? All right. So at the end of each section, there's a section in red, which is the revisions that Moore has given once these Charlton characters were taken off limits and they renamed the project into Watchmen, and they're going to create all new superheroes.
Cool. Character revisions for the Watchmen project. Since the Charlton heroes seem to be out of the picture as far as this project goes, even though the basic storyline is still acceptable, it would seem that the thing to do is create new characters to take the place of the Charlton character in the plot line. By necessity, these will have some bold similarities to the existing Charlton heroes. But I think that they'll be used in such a different way and treated so unusually that in the end product, any unwanted similarities will be eliminated, so that you can slot these new characters into the story outline you already have. I'll explain which Charlton character they act as a surrogate for as we go along.
All right. Paul, give me a minute. I just need to go get something. I'll be right back.
Dokie.
I'll be right back, everyone.
Am I going to be live while you're away? Am I going to have to vamp?
I mean, just give me a minute.
Okay.
I'll be right back, everyone.
Hello, everyone. I do have Watchmen. I don't know if anyone's still watching this. Here we go. So this is the copy of Watchmen I have, which I think is quite old. So I don't know but no, it wouldn't. It doesn't have all this extra stuff. Oh, you're back. I was just showing everyone my old copy of Watchmen.
Yeah, I love that. I gave that away once I bought the Absolute Edition.
Yeah. What's this from? 19. Oh, I don't know where this is from. 1987.
Oh, wow.
That can't be right. No, I think that's just the copyright. I don't know when this is from. It would have been around like early 90s, late 80s, though, I think.
Yeah, I think that that's, that was the cover that was used pretty much every year.
Yeah.
And I mean, I love that cover just because it was so unusual. The broken window. I prefer it to the smiley face cover. It also has the old coloring.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I like that. I like the old coloring. And I don't like the cover they use that's like them all posed together like a conventional superhero team. That's the cover they seem to use now.
No, I don't like it either.
Mm.
There's also one that they use from an old design by Dave Gibbons where Ozymandias has longer hair.
Oh, yeah.
Rorschach has a pinstripe suit. I don't understand why they would use that. It's off model, but okay.
Yeah.
I just want to say to everyone before we go on, there is this book. It's called Watching Time, the Unauthorized Watchmen Chronology. It's by our friend Rich Handley. It takes all Watchmen material before Doomsday Clock and puts them in a timeline. I did write the afterword for it. So I will paste that link in the chat. Also, I just want everybody to know that the super chat is on. So if you'd like to use the super chat, you can do so. That's a nice way of saying give us money. Love you all. Thank you so much. But seriously, you don't have to. Just only if you want to do it. Okay. All right, let's get to Captain Atom.
Yay! Everyone's favorite superhero, Captain Atom.
Everyone's favorite superhero. So famous for being replaced by a much more interesting version of himself. Okay, Captain Atom. Captain Atom is 40 years old, at least chronologically. Physically, he hasn't aged a day since the nuclear accident that broke him down into his component molecules and somehow allowed him to restructure himself into an entirely new form of life. He is still very much a part of the American military setup and is proud to be so, although his pride has been tempered over the years with a sense of growing alienation, not with the military alone, but with the whole of the material world that he has not truly felt a part of since the accident that turned him from Captain Atom to Captain Atom. He was the first superhero, more or less, and is still the most well-known and popular, with a possible exception of Peter Cannon Thunderbolt, who we'll get to in a minute. He is still the only superhero with real, non-artificial powers, and his position in the super hierarchy of this world is comparable to that of Superman on Earth 1. He's the first, and he's the best. Full stop. See, this is why Charlton sucks. He's the first, and he's the best. That said, he also causes more problems and has more problems than the rest of his super kid put together. The problems he causes are mostly political, and he causes them just by being there. Sounds like Captain Atom. There is the growing unbalance between East and West in terms of military supremacy that I mentioned earlier, and the fact that most anti-superhero sentiment and paranoia is aimed at Captain Atom simply because he's the most prominent target. The personal problems that he has, on the other hand, are far more complex.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that when he turned, he stopped thinking of Captain Atom and turned to Dr. Manhattan, he got rid of that military aspect.
No, he reversed it. He made it so that the military got Dr. Manhattan after.
Yeah, but like it says here, he's still very much a part of the American military setup and is proud to be so. That was never an aspect of Dr. Manhattan. But I guess it all fed into that sort of like going through the motions thing that Dr. Manhattan ended up doing, which is still kind of there.
Yeah, I mean, Dr. Manhattan's never proud to be anything.
No.
They get rid of all the emotion and stuff.
Yeah. But like John, what's his name? Osterman wasn't proud to be part of the American military setup or anything like that.
No, he just was in the military because he couldn't be a watchmaker anymore.
Yeah.
You could have been a watchmaker, dude. Like, you hadn't changed the world yet. I will point out, Paul, that when Grant Morrison did the Multiversity, and he was doing it with the Charlton heroes, the thing that he did to Captain Atom was basically turn him into Dr. Manhattan.
Yeah.
That's because Dr. Manhattan is so much more interesting than Captain Atom. I am so sorry to like the 5 Captain Atom fans out there.
Do you know what I love about the most recent Captain Atom design that he's had since the 80s, since he became a DC property? He's all silver, right? And he looks like he's nude, like Dr. Manhattan. But then he's got those little blue socks at the bottom. It just looks like he's walking around nude with just his little socks on. And I quite like that. It's quite funny.
Still, my favorite use of Captain Atom is in Justice League Unlimited, where they basically use him as, we need the bad guy to beat up someone really strong.
Yeah.
Who should it be? Captain Atom.
Do you think there's an amazing Captain Atom story waiting to be told that doesn't feed off Dr. Manhattan?
I mean, I think a great writer could probably come up with an amazing story for anyone.
Yeah.
But who would it be for Captain Atom? Like, what kind of angle would it have to take? I don't know. I think it'd have to be a comedy.
Do you reckon? Do you think someone like Tom King could do something, because he's got that kind of CIA background?
Oh, yeah. I think he'd have a field day with it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
There we go. If you're watching.
Go ahead. It's yours, guys. Run with it.
Yeah.
All right, Paul, let's go.
Try to imagine what it would be like to be Captain Atom. Just try. Just try.
Just try it. Just try.
The desk you're sitting at and the chair you're sitting on give less of an impression of reality and solidity to you if you know that you can walk through them as if they weren't there at all. Everything around you is somehow more insubstantial and ghostly, including the people that you know and love. Also, by virtue of your very nature, you would tend to see things from a subatomic viewpoint all the time, rather than just when you've had 5 or 6 beers and happen to be feeling philosophical. While most of us are intellectually aware that both our own bodies and the reality surrounding us are composed of billions of gyrating waves or particles or whatever the current quantum theory states, we can forget this disconcerting fact quite easily and live out our lives as if we were something more than apparently random energy configurations in a senseless and infinite holocaust of chaotic electrical patterns. That's a very long sentence.
It's a very long sentence.
Captain Atom would not be so fortunate. He would know himself and the world about him from a perspective far more alien than that of the most rabid quantum theorist. He would experience the paradoxes of reality at a quantum scale of existence, that things can exist in 2 places at the same time, then certain particles can travel backwards through time and exhibit physical properties that are exactly the reverse of normal physical laws, that cause and effect does not seem to apply in the same way beneath a certain submicroscopic level. These mind-numbing conundrums would be a mundane and ordinary part of Captain Atom's everyday existence. The way I see it, while he is no longer human enough to be driven mad by this experience, he is no longer human enough to feel much attachment to the world and its concerns. He does his uttermost out of a sense of blind duty, which he adopts to give some sense of random purpose to his curious existence. But it wouldn't take much for him to withdraw from the world completely into some sort of mystical hermithood and contemplative isolation. So this is interesting because this is what I was saying earlier on about, like, he took that military, that blind sense of duty out. And I was trying to think to myself as I was reading, what did he replace it with actual Dr. Manhattan? And it was Silk Spectre, wasn't it? That was the thing keeping him going through the motions.
Everything else, and he goes to Mars.
Yeah.
Well, this is interesting to me because, like, this isn't Captain Atom at all.
No.
Like, I've read a few Captain Atom Charlton comics, and he is not like this. Captain Atom is a very, very generic, premier superhero character, trying to be Superman in the atomic age. This isn't Captain Atom at all. He was taking liberties with him.
Yeah.
Way before this turned into Watchmen.
I mean, this is something that, like, there's such a pressure in fandom, especially these days, of, oh, you've got to stay true to the source material, And you had, like, comic creators going way back, like John Byrne, who were really like, oh, you've got to stay true to the source material, And there's so much importance put on that. And it's like, well, do you always have to stay true to the source material? Because that's not what Alan Moore was doing here at all. Not even the spirit of the source material.
No, not in any way. Because if you had just used the Charlton characters as they were, it would have been boring.
Yeah.
Also, John Byrne is not one to talk about respecting the source material.
Well, this is it. But I wonder if this sort of dogmatic kind of religious adherence to, the creator's original intentions, for what is essentially just, Mickey Mouse, Mickey Mouse characters, is it that important, and is it holding back creativity? Is it holding back storytelling?
It is 100% holding back storytelling, because I think that, so not to spoil anything, but on Monday I will be launching the interview that I did with Mike Carlin a few months ago. Mike Carlin, legendary Superman Group editor from the Triangle era. And one of the things that he keeps saying in it was one of the reasons the Triangle Era was so successful, but was because it tried new things. It wasn't beholden to what came before. And he wants current Superman creative teams to try new things. It shouldn't resemble the Triangle Era. It shouldn't resemble what he did. It should, because he's done with the book. It shouldn't be that way. And I think that's just true for any corporate owned character. You only move forward by moving forward. Sometimes you move forward by like looking back, right? But that's only after you've moved forward already.
Yeah.
You can't stay still. You can't stagnate.
Yeah.
Captain Marvel, Shazam, disappeared in the mid 50s, and then they brought him back in the 70s and tried to recapture the magic by having him drawn by CC Beck and having the same kind of zany, whimsical, over the top adventures. And it wasn't the same. It wasn't the same, even though the quality of the stories was not really that far. Because you don't get anywhere by staying still.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, ironically, like since I brought him up already, just to use him as an example again, I mean, the work of John Byrne, the stuff he did on Superman, he kind of, in a way, he kind of rode roughshod over the original kind of status quo of Superman,
Yes.
and that's not me complaining, because he brought a new kind of aspect to the character, and he pushed the character forward. And then when he tried to do the same thing to Spider-Man, he stayed exactly to the recipe of Lee and Ditko, and it was pointless because you just had rehashed fan fiction of the Lee and Ditko stuff, and it was utterly pointless.
One of the things that Byrne did with Superman that was so genius was bring back Ma and Pa Kent.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's overturning a piece of the status quo that had been in place for, at that point, 50 years.
Yeah. And, he wanted Lara, Superman's mother, to go in the rocket with baby Superman and actually give birth to him on the Kent farm, and which I wouldn't have necessarily wanted to see, but I kind of think it's a very good mindset to be in, I think, when you're revamping a character, saying like, okay, how far can I go? How far can I take it?
Probably more straightforward than the birthing matrix.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I'm kind of glad that I didn't see a woman die during childbirth in my Superman comic. I think that would have been a bit too unpleasant for me, but
been a little traumatic.
Yeah, but I think it's that kind of boldness is generally a good attitude to have, I think, when you're revamping these characters, and when you're telling stories with these characters,
Right, move forward. Give me something different. I don't want the same thing that I've always seen, right?
Yeah. I
mean, you've been reading Mark Waid's Daredevil, which I think is brilliant. Mark Waid's Daredevil partly is brilliant because it's not Frank Miller's Daredevil.
Well, this is it. Frank Miller did such great work on Daredevil, and then everyone tried to do the same thing. And it wasn't really until, Mark Waid came along that we actually got something different. And, and it really stood out,
Yeah, different is good, guys.
Yeah.
Different is good. All right. One thing that would make his relationships with human beings far more painful and difficult is something alluded to earlier. He is 44 years old and still looks 25. What effect would that have on the attitude of his human supporting cast towards him? I don't recall the earliest Captain Atom supporting cast. See, I told you, it's like not memorable. But I'd like to round up any that we could dig out and make up those that we can't in order to demonstrate Captain Atom's alienation in graphic and human terms. I can't remember if the Captain had a human love interest back in those early days before Nightshade. Oh, so that was already in place. But let's say that he had, for the sake of argument. She's now 44, and she looks and feels 44 as well. The young man that once she loved and possibly slept with, is still as youthful and virile as ever, and that she was aged and started past her prime. How would she feel about that? How would Captain Atom feel watching her grow old and eventually die while he remained the same constantly? I think that human lives would seem very transient and brief to the captain. I don't know if you saw David Bowie and Nick Roig's Man Who Fell to Earth, but something similar was done. The David Bowie character remained the same throughout the film, and events happened so quickly that it was difficult to realize at first that they were taking place over years rather than days. It's only when you notice his human girlfriend and associates start to get flabbier and grayer and more wrinkled, while he remains exactly the same, that you realize you are seeing this from a nearly timeless alien perspective. The effect is pretty disturbing and disorientating, and I see Captain Atom's point of view as being very similar. Paul, you're a big Bowie fan.
Yes.
Have you seen The Man Who Fell to Earth?
I have, and it is great, and it is disturbing and disorientating. That effect not just that effect he describes, but the aging. I mean, but just the whole thing is yeah, it's very much from so this quite fast moving kind of alien perspective, and you're not always quite sure what's going on or how far things have moved on, and it is very disorientating, but it's very good, and you can definitely see The Man Who Fell to Earth in Dr. Manhattan. I think that sort of detached kind of sadness, is definitely there.
I'm surprised that Captain Atom and Nightshade were a thing. So I guess that was he's taking Dr. Manhattan and Silk Spectre from that already.
Can you imagine though being as old and decrepit as 44? Just imagine being that old. It's just old and flabby and wrinkled. 44.
Oh my goodness. 44 years old. 3 years from now.
Yeah, thank God I'm only 42. It's fine.
Sometimes I see these memes that shows like what they depicted 44 as, like back in the 80s, and it's always like this the grandpa type,
Yeah.
Like what happened in the last 4 years?
Yeah, it's so weird, isn't it? It's kind of like, because now like Robert Downey Jr. is Iron Man in his 50s, and you couldn't imagine that, could you? And like I remember in the 80s, well, in the 90s, thinking, oh, you couldn't have Christopher Reeve back as Superman now because he'd be too old, and he's only like, well, early 40s, I guess. Like, he wasn't that old. Like, it's yeah. Of course, in Hollywood, of course, that only applies to men,
Of course, no,
yeah,
absolutely. If the genders were reversed here, it would be a completely different story.
Yeah.
We have a comment from Mike Edson saying, Happy New Year from Florida. Always good to see the cube going live. Happy New Year, Mike.
Happy New Year.
Okay.
So, all right, Paul. Where are we? Yes, since we last saw Captain Atom in the 60s, many things have happened to him.
Wait, hold on. Lamar says in July he'll be 45.
Oh, wow.
Lamar, you're old and decrepit now. It's not us. Alan Moore said it.
Yeah. That's the 80s Alan Moore thinks we're over the hill now. So I want to use real time as opposed to comic book time throughout this series. It's the use of comic book time and the fear of characters aging that has led to a lot of the boggling convolutions of logic that have somehow become absorbed into the whole superhero mythos. As I said earlier, we have a chance here to design a continuity with hindsight and avoid all that. I don't have the full details worked out, but a rough outline would be as follows. In the 70s, while the various Charlton heroes were not having their adventures chronicled, the first real wave of superhero-related troubles started to emerge, as detailed in my section on the world earlier on. America first realized the tactical possibilities of a costume superhuman and began to apply them to its foreign policy. At the same time, pressure mounted at home from citizens worried about the effect of superheroes upon law and society. Since Captain Atom was fast becoming vital to America's overall defense strategy, laws were pushed through that would legitimize the superhero. These led to the legality problem that I spoke of earlier and culminated in the police strike of 1977. The strike lasted 3 days, and there was absolute carnage, finally forcing the government to consider changing the legislation. Since they thought that since they could not outlaw superheroes outright without getting rid of Captain Atom, they revised the law so that it was okay to be a superhero as long as you fulfilled certain other requirements, such as scientific research or work towards national security in certain areas. So again, like I think we see, Mark Miller again. I as much as I hate to say it, I do quite like Civil War, Mark Miller's Civil War. But again, it was touted as this really revolutionary thing, but it's all Watchmen, isn't it?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And like, it's not that I don't like Civil War, both the comic and the movie. It's that it's not as realistic as you might think it is.
No.
Right? It's just it's superheroes fighting, guys. That's what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, again, like I kept saying earlier, I think that this was the natural evolution of the superhero genre. We were always going to see like a take at some point as to how the world itself would react to superheroes. And then after Watchmen, Kingdom Come did it. The one superhero thing that Disney Pixar did, its whole thing is about outlawing superheroes. It's like, and that was always going to be the reaction that we were going to see at some point. Like, how does the real world react to it? And the first thing is going to be legality, obviously.
I think the superhero aging thing is interesting, isn't it? Because that was how we met, wasn't it? Online, was talking about Spider-Man aging.
You know what? Mike Edson, who is currently on the stream, did ask me recently, like, how did we meet? And we'll tell that story now, Mike. Both Paul and I, around 12 years ago, or oh my god, it was like 14 years ago.
Oh yeah.
All right, 14 years ago.
Late 2000s, wasn't it? Like
late 2000s, yeah. We both had our separate blogs. I was the Comics Cube and he was the last of the famous international fanboys.
Yeah.
And we both had comments about superheroes aging, specifically referring to Spider-Man as the default Spider-Man argument back then was, should he be married in age or should he stay a certain age? And we both agreed that Spider-Man should be consumed by us, the generation after us, and the generation after them, etc. So, and superheroes aging is an outlier, specifically saved for stories like Watchmen. Have you changed your stance on that at all?
No, I this thing is really good. Let's have more of it. Is that such a, why have we got to like, oh, well, Spider-Man's really good, so of course we have to see him die in the comics and not have any more Spider-Man, and make room for a new superhero. It's like, well, why? Because it's not as if like the next generations are missing out, because they like Spider-Man too, as we've seen,
Exactly.
Yeah, and I don't think it necessarily holds stories back either, because even with these characters that aren't aging, I mean, you've already got a Superman that's old enough to have been married and raised a 17-year-old kid, and that is the main continuity at the moment. Like, Superman's got a teenage son, Batman's got a teenage son, and you more and more, especially in the current Batman run, but even before that, you've since Dark Knight Returns, really, you've seen Batman dealing with, a failing body. You know, Batman getting older, getting twinges and pains, you know, because that is quite interesting. So it's not like we're missing out on those kind of stories, you know?
Yeah, there are stories like that.
Yeah,
I,
even
I have changed my mind a little bit, which
yeah,
is that back then I said that Spider-Man shouldn't be married because the whole idea of him, the whole idea is for me is that he dates and his dates are terrible for him. Mary Jane Watson is obviously the end game,
mm,
but it's specifically because he's the end game, she's the end game that they shouldn't be married. I have changed my mind a little bit. I'm a little bit more open to that now, simply because the existence of Miles Morales
mm,
in the same universe
yeah,
does age Peter Parker.
yeah. So
So
that's already happened. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, that's unavoidable. So if that's going to happen, then okay, I'm a little bit more open to that. But if he were still the only solo Spider-Man, I would stick with my original statement.
I mean, like, I personally, and obviously this makes us mortal enemies by the rules of the internet. I am against the spider marriage still, but because you know, I think we've covered this before, because not because of the aging thing, but because I think, you know, Peter Parker is always someone who will put Spider-Man first, you know,
Yeah.
and mess up anything he tries to do with his Peter Parker life because of that. That is his gift and that is his curse, right? Yeah.
I
so,
seem
but
to
so
have
that,
heard those words before.
yeah. So that's where I'm coming from, and it's not so much an aging thing. So I think, and now I think Peter Parker. I mean, they may say he's in his late 20s in the comic, but he's not. Even as they write him now, I mean, he's a guy in his 30s. I think.
No, he's in his 30s. No.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so they
I
might
do
like to pretend he's in his late 20s, but he's not.
I mean, I still do prefer him dating people who aren't Mary Jane, just because
Mm,
I think, like, I love when he dates the Black Cat because she's so terrible for him.
yeah,
That's it. Like, more than any other character, I like it when bad things happen to him.
yeah,
So, all right, we've gotten
yeah,
away
yeah,
from the plot here, but I hope that answers your question, Mike. That is how Paul and I met.
yeah.
Uh, so All right. The result of this was that Captain Atom and many other superheroes were forced to play it safe or risk breaking the law for a long while. Captain Atom has been engaged in various government activities since then, and very little crime fighting, if any at all. He's been doing quantum research and space exploration projects and various other little jobs here and there. This has eased the pressure on the home front, but if anything, has aggravated the international tension by alarming the Russians who see Captain Atom's new role as being more closely bound up with the military than ever before. The Soviets insist upon referring to Captain Atom as a weapon and have refused to take part in any arms limitation talks for as long as the Americans continue to use the captain for military purposes. The international situation is now very tense indeed, and every week there's some new incident to add fuel to a fire that is rapidly going out of control. Although accusations of vigilantism, I'm just going to finish this because it's like really close. Although accusations of vigilantism have dropped off since the law changes following the police strike and Captain Adams' subsequent period out of the public eye, there is still one public pressure group that has it in for Captain Atom. This is the anti-nuclear lobby, who have done their best to turn Captain Atom into a living symbol of all that is frightening about nuclear power and nuclear weaponry. This causes some problems that will be significant later in the strip. For the moment, however, we'll leave Captain Atom where he is, isolated, alienated at the center of political controversy on all sides, with a growing sense of complete indifference to everything and everyone. We now move on to the character who, while never a superstar of the Captain Atom Blue Beetle status, is possibly the most important character in the story that I hope to tell.
Ooh.
Um, was there an anti-nuclear lobby in Watchmen? No, right? It's just like the scare tactics used by Ozymandias.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm
But
surprised at that.
yeah. But it's still a story about nuclear power, isn't it, Watchmen? I mean, it's just like the whole thing is a criticism of the absurdity of the concept of a nuclear deterrent and mutually assured destruction, isn't it? Because
That's it.
this is a world where America have won, right? They've won the arms race. because they've got the ultimate weapon, but they're closer to death than ever before. So
because there is mutually assured destruction.
yeah. So it is like Alan Moore just saying this is such a stupid thing that is happening in the real world.
It's nice when you leave some commentary on things in your fictional work, and because I do think that it makes it a little bit more resonant than just having a generic superhero story. This is what makes Watchmen different from a regular Charlton comic.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, this is something we talked about in our read through of the Twilight of the Superheroes, isn't it? Just this idea that like how great it is when these superhero stories have something to say about us,
About us, yeah, that's true.
Like this, I'm repeating myself here, but like just there's so much on the internet saying, oh, this is a story about how great Superman is, and this is a story about the concept of Batman, and rah rah rah, and it's like, okay, that's all very well, but let's have some stories about us. What can these characters tell us about us?
Well, I've said this before too, but this is exactly why Alan Moore does not like The Killing Joke.
Yeah.
Because he would prefer a story to say something about us, about the real world, about human beings, about the human condition. And there's really nothing in The Killing Joke that does that. The Killing Joke is a story about how Batman and the Joker are two sides of the same coin, which is a great character study, but it says nothing about.
Yeah.
It says nothing useful about the real world.
Well, it's like Doomsday Clock, isn't it? It's a story about Superman, which is lovely. I like stories about Superman, but
Well, the big difference between Watchmen and Doomsday Clock, I think, is Watchmen is in fact a meta commentary on superheroes. There's a lot of talk about there's a lot of talk in it about the golden age, the how things got darker, etc., etc. But there is commentary about the real world, and you could see that with the back matter, especially with the back matter of Watchmen. Doomsday Clock, all of the meta commentary stuff is about comics. It's not even just about comics. It's about DC Comics. It's about things like Nathaniel Dusk and how DC Comics has evolved over the years, which is fine, but it is a little bit self-indulgent.
Yeah, I mean it's masturbation, isn't it? It's
Well, see, that was the word I was thinking of, but I went with self-indulgent, Paul.
Just gotta lower the tone. Sorry.
You want to read the Dr. Manhattan
Dr. Manhattan, otherwise Doc Manhattan. Dr. Manhattan replaces Captain Atom in our lineup. A doctor of physics. The character received his awesome abilities during an experiment during the 60s designed to subtract particles from an atomic pattern while leaving the governing electromagnetic pattern itself intact. The doctor found himself with a subtracted body, but with an intelligence still somehow alive in the whirling subatomic ocean of being. After he put himself back together, after a fashion, he found out that he was a different person, possessing a wide range of quantum-related abilities. He can control his mass and density effortlessly and can alter the atomic structure of an object at will. His perceptions are geared towards the subatomic, and in general, he's an astonishingly powerful character. His powers tend to manifest themselves in more subtle and eerie ways than the pyrotechnics employed by other nuclear heroes, such as Firestorm, for an example. I think that in Dave's capable hands, he'll be instantly distinguishable from the thermonuclear characters that have gone before, if only because I shall be relying upon the massive amount of quantum theory that's come to light recently as a source of reference, rather than the comparatively little that was known when Captain Atom, Nuclear, and Dr. Spectrum, Man of the Atom were created. He's named after the project rather than the island, incidentally.
I just want to point out that Alan Moore I think he never finished high school. and
Mm,
therefore never went to college. But he's so incredibly well read. He reads stuff about quantum theory.
mm,
So, which is why I think a lot of the science fiction stuff that he writes, or even if you go back to Swamp Thing and all the stuff about the worms,
mm,
the planarian worms, it just all looks so authentic
mm,
and legitimately researched. So even if there were stuff around, that was done, any research that was done back when Captain Atom, Nuclear, I don't know who Nuclear is, and Doctor Spectrum, Man of the Atom were invented, I'm not so sure that the writers of the time would have gone in on that.
mm.
I think there are
Yeah,
certain writers who would. Alan Moore, Grant Morrison are definitely the two that come to my mind.
yeah, yeah,
But in terms of just really hard science fiction, I don't know. Mark Waid probably.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's interesting that Alan Moore, he's not reading this stuff because he's like, oh, this will make a good idea for a comic. You get the impression he's reading this stuff because he's just so curious about it.
He's reading them for fun,
Yeah, 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 yeah.
and it just permeates.
Mm.
All right,
And it's,
Paul,
oh, go
my air conditioning just died. I'm going to have to
on.
turn it back on. I'll be right back.
Okay. So I'm going to show you my book again while I'm vamping here. What's this? There's something inside here. I just saw something that I've been using as a bookmark in here. Now I've lost it and I want to know what it is.
This is the perils of doing a live stream. Things happen.
Oh, look at that. It's a picture of Morph.
What?
I must have used it as a bookmark. It's not my picture. It's a picture from the science center where I work. It's a picture of an animated clay character called Morph. There we go. One for the British viewers.
Aw. I was like, Morph. Morph is a character from X-Men 1992.
No, no, it's
All right.
yeah. Where were we?
Thunderbolt.
Thunderbolts.
We
Oh,
are at Thunderbolt / Ozymandias. Fun fact: Thunderbolt is somehow owned by the guy who created him, whose name escapes me right now. So while DC had him for a while, they completely lost any rights to him, which is why we never hear about Peter Cannon Thunderbolt
mm.
anymore.
But
Thunderbolt, yeah.
it was Mike Collins, wasn't it? Who
Was it Mike Collins?
worked on him? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Who I like Mike Collins. He's great.
And if you take a look at Thunderbolt's original costume, which is half black, half red, that is derived apparently from the Golden Age Daredevil.
There we go. By the way, I should clarify that I meant it was Mike Collins who worked on him for DC, right? He wasn't the guy who created him.
He's not the guy who created him.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, yeah. But
All right. Thunderbolt. Peter Cannon is about 37. Oh my God, he's younger than us.
ancient.
I can't do this anymore. Maybe we've outgrown this hobby.
What have we done with our life?
What have we done? What's my life been about, really? In Captain Adam's case, this lack of age. Okay, Peter Cannon is about 37, but he also looks younger. In Captain Adam's case, this lack of age was due to his complete control over his body's atomic structure, which would prevent any decay. In Cannon's case, it's simply because he's a superb paragon of humanity in every detail. He has a flawless physique and is at peak condition all the time. And because he is able to use the full 100% of his brain power. Wow, take that, Deathstroke. Which gives him a certain amount of fakir-like control over his bodily processes. Captain Adam is immortal. Peter Cannon, barring accident, might live to be about 150. The whole point behind the way I think Thunderbolt should be treated is that we should try to make the reader keenly aware of just what it would be like to be 10 times more intelligent than the most intelligent human that ever lived. As they said over the phone, Napoleon got quite a long way on just a normal 1/10 of his brain power. What wouldn't Peter Buchanan be able to do, given the inclination? Okay, I think for somebody who clearly does a lot of scientific research, um, I think it's weird that at this point in time, it's not known that this whole 10% thing is a myth.
Yeah. They must have known back then that that was bobbins, though.
I would think so.
Yeah.
I don't think it's that recent. I, like, but Deathstroke was
It's
created
a
just a
lovely
few years
little
before this.
conceit, though, isn't it? Like fictional conceit, like, that we're us losers are just using like 5% of our brain. you know?
Well, you know what? I'm about to use 25%.
It's he's a real like sort of it's very golden age, isn't it? This idea of like this this guy who's human but has made himself more than human, like kind of Doc Savage and the Shadow kind of,
Yeah,
you know. And I quite like that.
self-made.
Yeah, I suppose Alan Moore went back to it with Tom Strong, didn't he?
Oh, that's true. That's true. Yeah.
Yeah. But I just really like that, and Batman. It wasn't as much. I mean, that's obviously where Batman came from, that idea, but it wasn't as emphasized as much. I don't feel throughout his history until relatively recently, where people like Grant Morrison have really leaned into that sort of like
Into the pulp. Into
yeah,
that.
the pulpy
The,
like I'm a bit more than your average man, kind of thing.
but see, the thing is, I think you have to, because when you talk about somebody who's just who has a flawless physique, is in peak condition all the time, and he might live to be about 150. I mean, a part of that is because this person has a lot of money.
Mm.
But a part of that is because, well, he's just got really, really good genetics.
Yeah.
Batman has really, really good genetics.
Again, we're back to this right wing thing, aren't we? Like, this the right wing kind of streak running through the very concept of superheroes.
I mean, just the very idea that some people are born better than others.
Yeah.
Pretty much. I think whenever I see an argument about Batman or Captain America, the argument against Captain America is that always like, oh, well, he's only got his powers because of the drugs.
Mm.
I'm like, well, you know what? If he was born with a perfect physique,
yeah.
and $1 billion,
I must emphasize, by the way, that when I was talking about these sort of pulpy heroes like the Shadow and Doc Savage, and saying I quite like this idea of someone who was more than human, kind of thing. I meant that as a sort of silly fictional conceit. I didn't mean it as a sort of worldview, just like, just really want to emphasize that I'm not big on eugenics.
I didn't think you were, but I guess it's a good thing that you clarified that.
Yeah. Have I made myself sound more like I actually do like eugenics now? I don't.
Oh wow, I'm just flipping through this and I realized the Dr. Manhattan section is about 3 or 4 times as long as any other section.
Oh wow, that's interesting.
So this is gonna, yeah. So as weird as it is, the rest of these are gonna go much quicker than that one.
Mm.
Okay.
So the whole point, is that where I'm at?
No, one thing he certainly would be.
Oh, okay. Oh yes, I've got you. One thing he certainly would be able to do is see the anti-superhero backlash of the mid-70s coming a mile away. And naturally, he reacted to it in the most logical way. He retired from active superheroing long before the crunch came, thus remaining a popular and sympathetic character throughout the various social eruptions that followed. Having successfully distanced himself from his superhero image in time to retain credibility, he is regarded as totally blameless in all the various charges that are hurled at superheroes. For one thing, he has tended, since his retirement, to become a very public figure. He revealed his identity very early on and no longer wears a mask, diffusing accusations of secrecy and cover up. He also paid a lot of attention to his public image by making frequent television appearances, both as a celebrity in his own right and as the superb gymnast and athlete that he is. In a series of stunning performances, the proceeds of which go straight to charity. He is a public heartthrob and a sports world sensation of the Torvill and Dean variety, much loved by all.
I don't know who Torvill and Dean is.
Torvill and Dean are a couple of ice skaters, figure skaters from. They're very sort of popular in the 80s, certainly over here.
Okay.
I don't know how world famous they were. Possibly because weird things were famous in the 80s. Like Uri Geller was like world famous for some reason in the 70s and 80s. So maybe Torvill and Dean were as well.
I'll tell you who this reminds me of.
Yeah.
The whole retiring before the backlash came, Will Eisner. Because if you think about it, right, Will Eisner did The Spirit, changed the face of comics. And then right before the Comics Code, right before the Congress hearings, he retires The Spirit. And then he does all of these preventive maintenance manuals for like the next 20 years.
Mm.
And then, Marvel shows up, and then the underground movement shows up, Arkham and the like. And then there's this whole movement, all of this media consumption, etc. And then when all that dies down, he comes back with a contract with God and launches a graphic novel.
Yeah.
So that's who it reminds me of. I'm not saying Will Eisner was using 100% of his brain, but I do think that the leading people in a certain field, especially because if you really think about it, Will Eisner was probably the best businessman out of that whole original guard of comics. Maybe next to Bob Kane, because at least Will Eisner did work. And I think anyone with that kind of business savvy, so in a leading person with a business savvy in that field, actually ends up being able to spot things coming down a mile away. And I think that's true for somebody like Ozymandias.
Yeah. Do you know what? Again, and apologies for harping on about this so much. What it made me think of was Tony Stark in Civil War. Because the whole thing with him is that he sees it coming, the superhero backlash, the registration. And that's why he chooses his side that he does, is because he's seen this coming for years. And again, I just like to say, Civil War wasn't that original and took a lot from Alan Moore.
I mean, I do think that there's a lot of things to be said about Mark Millar and the way he brands himself. I'm not so sure he believes his own hype.
Oh yeah, it's all bobbins, isn't it? What he says,
it's like he knows. Yeah, he knows. Yeah. Like he knows it's for the marketing. But I do think it is interesting how we do keep going back to Civil War in this discussion, because it does show how Watchmen did, in fact, influence or have an effect on just superhero comics in general. We can't move on with the genre in this direction, in this dark, realistic direction, without constantly referring back to Watchmen.
Yeah. I mean, it's, the character of like Dr. Manhattan has shaped things, but like Ozymandias has shaped Batman, Iron Man, Reed Richards,
Lex
all
Luthor.
kinds of things. Lex Luthor, yeah, absolutely. It's it's incredible how influential this is. It's like there's that thing about the Velvet Underground, isn't it? Like everyone who saw the Velvet Underground went out and started a band or whatever. It's like Watchmen is like the Velvet Underground, isn't it?
Well, comics. You know what somebody said in a documentary, I think it was Paul Levitz. I could be wrong. But they said that they would read Watchmen as it came out, and then every time Watchmen came out, they'd go back home, rip apart whatever they were doing at the time, and start over.
Wow.
It's a good thing Watchmen was always late, so you'd only have to rip out
Yeah.
your comic every couple of months instead of every month. All right, let's move on.
Okay. You go for it.
Okay. He is also very rich. He owns a cup. He is also very rich. It's his ultimate superpower. He owns a number of companies quite openly, and although nobody knows it but him, he also owns a number of companies covertly by virtue of having bought up shares in the name of totally manufactured identities. Most of the money that people know about comes from the thriving line of Thunderbolt merchandising, including action dolls. That's a new term. Posters, self-help records, books, films, licensed Saturday morning cartoons, and so on and so on. Thunderbolt is an industry and a very profitable one. He is everybody's darling. The establishment loves him because he sums up a dream of free enterprise embodied in one perfect mind and body. The left wing respects him for his moral and political pronouncements, which tend to reflect the pacifistic spiritual doctrines that have made him what he is today. He speaks out occasionally against nuclear proliferation, and the threat of war in tones so eminently sensible and unarguable, and with a personality so completely magnetic that everybody listens to him. This guy is so perfect that it's not true, except, of course, that it is true. Paul, I'm not sure in today's day and age it's possible to be everybody's darling.
No, but it's interesting how like Moore saw this thing of like projecting people's own values back at them. You know, which does happen these days. I mean, that's what Trump's doing, you know. And but the one thing that Alan Moore didn't predict was that, you know, Ozymandias actually had to make himself these things that he claimed to be, whereas Trump can just turn up at a rally and say he's these things without
and you'll
having
have people believing it.
Yeah. And that's enough. You know? So that's interesting. What another interesting thing there is, again, you know, goes back to this sort of Reagan Thatcher thing of this sums up a dream of free enterprise, you know, embodied in this perfect body. Again, this sort of Thatcher Reagan dream satirized.
And he as the perfect body. I mean, as we're saying, like he might be left wing in his pronouncements, but he is the right wing ideal.
Yeah.
And you know who that reminds me of is Captain America, a character who has always been left wing. But
yeah,
a lot of, and even Superman actually, but a lot of right wingers do latch on to these two characters.
Yeah. And do you know what? Actually, the more I think about it, actually, yeah, this idea of being all things to all people, I think there were some parallels later on. I mean, it's something that people like Bill Clinton and Tony Blair are often accused of, isn't it? You know, this idea of and correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, because I'm not an expert on this. I think this idea of triangulation is that right? Of you know, saying one thing and kind of doing another and appealing to everyone while you're doing it. And I feel like that's something that both Bill Clinton and Tony Blair could credibly be accused of, you know, of appealing to these sort of quite liberal people with what they say, and appealing with these sort of more right-wing people with their actions. And, you know, and I know it's a lot more complicated than that in the cases of both men, but, you know, that is something they've both been accused of, I think.
Lamar says that the hip hop equivalent to the Velvet Underground would be Gangstar. JD knows what I'm talking about.
Okay. There
we go. Let's continue. He
doesn't have much to do with the other superheroes, and Captain Atom has gone on record as saying that he has no love at all for Thunderbolt, largely because of Cannon's anti-nuclear pronouncements. He keeps to himself, and nobody knows what goes on inside his head. They can't even begin to imagine what goes on inside the head of someone 10 times more intelligent than they are. And for the most part, they don't try. They don't wonder what material wealth and strings of companies would mean to a creature of that degree of intelligence. They don't consider that he would not care for them as properties in themselves, as most people would, but rather that he might have some idea on how he could use them to get what he wants. And that brings us to the questions of just exactly what the most intelligent and most perfectly evolved organism upon the planet actually does want, which is mostly what our story is about. This
You
is
know what?
interesting.
It
Go on,
is
sorry.
interesting. It is interesting because that is what Watchmen is about. Watchmen is about what Ozymandias wants.
Yeah. But this creature that Moore has created in Ozymandias, or Thunderbolt in this case, he's still this. I mean, you get aspects of the real world reflected in him, but he's still just as ridiculous and larger than life a
Yeah.
character as a good Peter Cannon Thunderbolt would be, right? So, and it's interesting that, like, this is the realistic, grounded character, but
Yeah.
he's not. He's just as stupid as Peter Cannon Thunderbolt, but he's evil,
You
or
know,
rather not evil, but like amoral. And it's interesting how that scene that automatically makes him a more grounded, realistic character to the eye. I'm not saying in the case of Moore, but to the eyes of a lot of readers.
no, that's true. One thing that I am curious about is that we know that this is a murder mystery, right?
Mm.
And we know that in the final product, Ozymandias is the one who did it.
Yeah.
Now, what I think structurally, what Moore does with it is that he actually keeps Ozymandias in the background for a long time until it's about time to reveal that he's the one who did it, which I think, looking back, is a little bit of a telegraph.
Mm-hmm.
Although it worked, so I don't know how much of a telegraph it actually is. Hindsight is 2020. My question is, do you think that the Thunderbolt was going to be the one who did it originally? It sounds
Oh
like it,
yeah,
right?
absolutely. From reading this, I mean, with Doctor Manhattan and Captain Atom, there's changes. Not many, but that whole military thing is dropped, and the idea that Doctor Manhattan would care that Peter Cannon Thunderbolt was anti-nuclear seems silly now that we've read Watchmen, because obviously Doctor Manhattan is above even that.
Yeah, he doesn't care.
But I guess a more military focused Dr. Manhattan would care about that. So there's changes in Dr. Manhattan. But this description of Peter Cannon Thunderbolt is basically Ozymandias. He's there. Everything is there,
Yeah.
So he must have been the original baddie.
The root of what Thunderbolt wants to do is tied up with the fact that he is smart enough to see things coming a mile off. In the early 70s, he saw that a backlash against superheroes was inevitable. At the same time, he saw that one other thing was inevitable: a world war, complete and final in its devastation, that would definitely occur no later than 1990. Wow, the far off world of 1990. And it struck the most intelligent being on the planet that there wasn't much point being the most intelligent being on the planet if there wasn't any planet. Thus, he began to plan accordingly. However, we'll leave Thunderbolt at this point and move on to the next member of our cast, being a character who probably ties with Captain Atom in terms of fan popularity.
I'm going to go off on a bit of a tangent here, but it just made me think of Iron Man there, that description you just read, and Tony
Oh,
Stark.
really?
And it just made me love Tony Stark even more. He's such a great character because, or rather, he's become such a great character in the years since this, because he's that. He can see these things coming, right? He can see the future coming
He's the
because
futurist.
he's a futurist because he's so clever. But rather than come up with evil schemes, he's terrified of it. Tony Stark is still human enough to be terrified of what he can see coming. So he literally encases himself in a suit of armor, because he's so scared of what's coming, And in the movies, they kind of, and then this is again, I think people kind of, because everyone's bloody sick of it, people are so dismissive of the MCU these days, and I think it's a bit reductive, because what they did with the character of Tony Stark over the course of 20 movies is so great, because we can see this character who can see the future because he's so clever and he's so terrified of it. He doesn't just put himself in a suit of armor. He wants to put the world in a suit of armor,
Mm-hmm.
And that's, I just think that's such a wonderful character, such a wonderful idea of the character. And so much more interesting than Ozymandias in a way. And this isn't a criticism of Alan Moore for not thinking of Tony Stark as we currently understand him, but it's so wonderful that it's this concept, these concepts that Moore's discussing here, has enhanced a character like Iron Man, has fed a character like Iron Man, and made him this rich, wonderful, sort of beautiful character he is today. Sorry, that was a bit of a tangent.
I do think that Ozymandias isn't as interesting as the other characters in Watchmen. Partly because we don't see him as much, as I mentioned.
Yeah.
They basically save him for the big reveal, which is like he is the one who did it. Which, by the way, there is in the first issue of Watchmen, right? Rorschach talks to Ozymandias and leaves his building using his grappling gun or grappling hook. And Ozymandias looks right at him, climbing down. And like on a reread, Ozymandias is thinking, I could just kill you right now.
Yeah.
By unhooking this grappling hook. But it's one of those brilliant things that that they work in at the beginning. It's like you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah,
and
yeah,
then when
yeah.
you do know it, know it, it's right there. It's pretty cool. I also think that one of the differences between Tony Stark and Reed Richards, because I know a lot of people like to compare the two, is Tony Stark really does look to the future more and really does like worry about the future more. Whereas I do feel like Reed Richards, a lot of it is in the moment. A lot of what he's thinking is in the moment.
And a lot of it is viewed as an academic problem for Reed. Whereas Tony's human enough to see the repercussions of these things and be scared of it,
Exactly.
Yeah. I just love Iron Man. Sorry, that's a bit of a tangent. I just think he's great.
Let's go on.
I digress.
All right. Paul is now going to read the red revision for Ozymandias.
Ozymandias is our replacement for Thunderbolt, a perfectly evolved man who takes human capability to its most extreme limit. I chose the name because it has a certain grandeur and pretension to it that seem to fit the character somehow, and because it will enable me to use "Look on my works, ye mighty in despair" as a title for the chapter where 1/3 of New York's population bite the bullet. His given name is Adrian Veidt. Is that right, by the way? Am I saying that right?
I think so, yeah.
Adrian Veidt, an American citizen of German descent born in Brooklyn during the Second World War. Despite, or possibly because of his working-class upbringing, his abnormally developed talent soon came to the notice of school and college authorities. And he was given a scholarship to study in Europe, from whence he journeyed to exotic climes, picking up stray pieces of information and techniques from almost all the world's more developed religious orders. After particularly vivid peyote experience under the supervision of the Brujo of South America, Veidt took up the identity of Ozymandias and became a crime fighter and general all-round public benefactor. During the 60s, as one of the youngest of the existent superheroes, Veidt became immediately popular with the entire youth culture. Somehow, when he revealed his identity and went public in 1973, he managed to take his adoring audience with him as a ready-made market for his many business associations and commercial productions.
Also a marketing genius.
Yes. This manipulator of people, I think that's how a lot of people in the real world at the moment like to see themselves, isn't it? As a sort of Ozymandias figure.
Well, because it's so easy now I mean, case in point, it's so easy now to like create a product where you're on the face of it, and it's all about like finding an audience, right?
Mm,
So, uh, and that's true of everything. Everything right now is marketing, whether it's actual marketing, whether it's politics, whether it's influencers or whatever else. Everything right now is about marketing,
mm.
and Ozymandias is the perfect example for it. And also, this is
But
not something we see in superhero comics a lot. Somebody who's just really good at marketing themselves.
yeah, that's true. Booster Gold.
Yeah, and he's played off as a joke for it.
Yeah. Do you know what's interesting though is part of what's so wonderful about Watchmen is that it's all bullshit. You know, everything Ozymandias says like about himself, it's all revealed as bullshit. And this is definitely something that the movie didn't get. But like when that is so important, that scene where he turns to Dr. Manhattan, he says, it all works out in the end, right? Because the whole thing about Dr. Manhattan, he's elevated to this superhuman. He becomes the reader, right? He can go between the pages. That
Yeah,
that's a god to a comic character is us, the reader, the three-dimensional reader who can go back and forth between the pages. And that's what Ozymandias thinks he is. But he's not, because he's still like, it's a happy ending, right? He's still thinking like
he's
a
thinking
comic book character.
linearly. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, and it just, that line just shows that it's all bullshit. Like everything Ozymandias says about himself is rubbish, and
yeah.
yeah,
And
it's so
Dr.
important.
Manhattan is like, what end?
Yeah, nothing ever ends. Yeah,
Nothing,
it's
nothing ends, Adrian.
yeah,
All right. We come to the most popular Charlton superhero, the Blue Beetle. Yay!
yeah. He's
As
great.
you as you may have begun to notice, the characters I mentioned so far are both pretty weird psychologically speaking, at least compared to human terms of reference. The Blue Beetle, on the other hand, is the most human of the entire bunch, and he will exist in this book as a standard against which the other characters are measured. If all the characters are weird and unusual, none of them will stand out. Thus, I see the Blue Beetle as being just an ordinary man who does extraordinary things, who sometimes makes mistakes or is uncertain about what's going on, and who sometimes feels afraid. He's not as remote and distant and godlike as Captain Atom, or as enigmatic, confident, and cerebral as Thunderbolt, or as obsessed as the Question, who we'll be getting to in a moment. But he is nonetheless a hero, maybe even more of a hero, in that blind courage does not come naturally to him. He is also the character who will go through the biggest changes in the course of the strip. Towards the end of the story in hand, he will emerge as one of the strongest and noblest characters. Although, when the strip opens, he's not really at his best. He's not even the Blue Beetle. Uh, I love Ted Kord, but I don't know how much of that is because of Justice League International.
Yeah,
And I've never read a Ted Kord comic before Justice League International, aside from Crisis on Infinite Earths. So I really don't know how much of it is him. How much of Justice League International
mm,
is faithful to Ted Kord.
yeah.
But I do
I mean, he
think
was always
it's
an
fascinating.
inventor, wasn't he? So that aspect would have been there, I guess. But
Yes. Well,
I can't
my
imagine.
joke for him is because he
Yeah,
was created by Steve Ditko. I see him as what if Peter Parker was never bitten?
yeah. I was just thinking about Night Owl. Does he end up being the strongest and most noble character in it?
No one ends up being the strongest and most noble
No.
character in it. No,
I,
they all give up.
but I mean, personally, I mean, like, I think from my personal worldview, he's the guy who does the right thing in that if it's possible to do the right thing in this situation, in that he acknowledges this situation is bigger than him, and anything like what Adrian did was vile, but
Yeah,
any attempt to reveal that could have such huge consequences that his own morality needs to be flexible enough to accommodate the possibility that he would make things worse. And that's quite heroic in the sense that I think he's doing the right thing as much as it's possible to do.
I mean, it's him and Laurie.
Yeah,
He and Laurie do that, and he and Laurie have the arc, as it were, right?
yeah,
Because they're both retired at the start of the story, and then they end up getting their heroic identities back, and they end up like being a kind of a badass again. I think everyone else kind of has a downward arc where they're all
Hmm.
humbled or die. And Ozymandias doesn't really have an arc.
I mean, maybe like in a way, they transcend the comic book character as well. Dr. Manhattan does, and so do they, because they are some of the few characters capable of understanding or at least acknowledging shades of grey at the end, right?
Mm-hmm. The
Whereas
two of them, yeah.
Adrian and Rorschach can't, and Dr. Manhattan doesn't care. So in their own way, they've become Dr. Manhattan too, in that they've just transcended the comic book page and they've become real people in the sense that they go away and they start a family and they live worthwhile, normal lives.
And
So maybe that's their arc.
I also think that's where something like Doomsday Clock loses the plot, because
Yeah,
when you have a sequel to Watchmen and you actively choose not to have Dan and Laurie in it, right? It's just
yeah.
you're losing the reader identification people. You're
But
losing
maybe
the
that's
people with the nuance.
but maybe that's what like Jeff Johns understood is that their arc. I mean, everyone's arc was done. What am I saying? But what could you do with those characters because their arc is done?
Their arc is done. That's true.
I mean,
Uh,
so everyone's
so
arc
but
is done.
everyone's arc is done.
Comedian's bloody dead, and he still brought him back. But
Is he next? No, he's not next. The question's gonna be next. Okay.
but yeah, yeah. So it just reminds me of League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, The Tempest, and
Ah,
the message there is very much Alan Moore and Kevin O'Neill saying like, well, what's so great about being more than human anyway? Um,
yes.
why
It's
can't we
the
just be
thing that keeps
happy
going
being human?
back.
Yeah, and he was doing that right back in Watchmen, in that like, yeah, Night Owl and Silk Spectre become more than superheroes because they become more than 2D fictional characters because they can embrace shades of grey.
Because they understand, they
Yeah,
understand texture and they understand nuance.
yeah,
And
yeah, yeah,
they understand that doing sticking to your principles might screw over other people.
yeah.
So
This is why people who come out of Watchmen are saying like, "Oh man, Rorschach was the hero. He didn't compromise." It's like, yeah, he's a dumbass for not compromising. He's a 2D fictional character, and it killed him.
if you were an NPC in that world, a non-playable character in that world, you would have wanted him to compromise.
Yeah, absolutely,
Uh,
absolutely. Yeah,
you
yeah.
know, what it reminds me of? It reminds me of Alan Moore, because when he signed with Jim Lee for America's Best Comics, which by the way I read about in Alan Moore Portraits of an Extraordinary Gentleman. Um, Go read it. It's available on Amazon for Alan Moore's 70th birthday. When Alan Moore did it for when Alan Moore signed for America's Best Comics for Jim Lee, and then Jim Lee sold Wildstorm to DC Comics, Alan Moore had a choice, which was either pull out of his principles to never work for DC Comics again. But then he decided to stay because the artists had already been committed and he didn't want to screw people out of work, which is, which kind of, I mean, it's not world threatening like what Dan and Laurie had to deal with, but it is a matter of like, do you stick by your guns or do you do what's beneficial to the community around you?
Yeah,
And,
yeah,
and I think in as much as you possibly can, I think that you you do what's right to the community around you.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
All right. Shall we go on?
Good, yeah. Where are we?
Of
Who,
all the
who?
superheroes,
Is it me?
Yeah, it's you.
Of all the superheroes caught up in the panic of the mid-70s, the Blue Beetle is the only one to actually completely retire. He's returned to a life as a scientist, and although he is brilliant within his field, the enforced inactivity has led him to some deep thinking, and some unsettling doubts have emerged as a result. He wonders whether the whole superhero thing was some sort of bizarre extended adolescence that he would have grown out of, even if tougher legislation hadn't forced him out of it. He wonders if there's something wrong with him mentally to have decided to become the Blue Beetle in the first place. More than this, he wonders why he can't get superheroing out of his mind. Even after this long time away from the costume, even after this long away from the costume, it's a bit like war veterans who get so used to the brutality and chaos of hard combat that they start to unravel as soon as they are expected to acclimatize themselves to peacetime civilian conditions. It's a bit like that for the Blue Beetle. Part of him wants to be done with the whole embarrassing and dangerous idea of superheroics, but part of him refuses to leave it alone. This puts him under some stress. The most frightening example of which is something that happens in a restaurant in an unguarded moment. Without realizing that he is doing it, the civilian Blue Beetle starts to construct a paranoid fantasy from the flimsiest of material evidence, coming to the conclusion that something funny is going on between other diners at the restaurant and the restaurant staff, being part of some secret criminal operation that only he, the Blue Beetle, can bust apart. At the last moment, he realizes that the whole thing is his invention, although not before he's made an embarrassing public exhibition of himself. He realizes that unless he comes to terms with his past soon, he's going to go completely off the rails sooner or later.
Well, that doesn't happen at all.
That does not. I guess it would kind of undermine the whole thing that, like, there is a paranoid conspiracy thing going on in the background. Yeah,
that's true.
Like, you can't. I guess you can't say, how daft is this view that being a superhero has made Blue Beetle think of this, this daft worldview, and then reveal that the daft worldview is correct.
I'll tell you what else I realized. So he's clearly given a lot of thought to the Blue Beetle, right? And the Night Owl, about he's retired at first, he's gonna have like this big arc, he's gonna be noble at the end, etc. But Night Owl and Silk Spectre have very similar arcs in the final product. Which makes me, and we'll get to this when we get to Nightshade, which makes me realize Alan didn't really think about Nightshade.
No.
Not at all. Which I think is in line with when we read Twilight.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the way he was looking at female characters.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure, that would change if we were talking about a later version of Alan Moore, or even just like anyone writing a story in the 2020s.
Yeah. But also it's look what he has to work with. I mean, even the Archie comics heroes that you showed me at the start, they're all blokes, right? And these guys, they're Nightshade's the only female hero here, that he has to work with.
There's one woman in the Archie comics, guys. It wasn't in the picture that I showed earlier. Her name is Fly Girl. She is the girlfriend of the Fly. Okay. Which is like, if you take a look at the Golden Age the Golden Age Justice Society, you take out Wonder Woman, so the only one left is Hawkwoman.
Yeah, but she doesn't come along till later, and neither does Black Canary, does she? So
yes. Yeah. So yes, there's not a lot to work with. That's true. I think that something that somebody once told me is that if you think Watchmen is a sexist piece of work, a part of that is because the source material is inherently sexist. The Charlton source material is inherently sexist. I do think there is something that's a different discussion altogether as to whether or not it is. And we're probably not the people to have that discussion with. So
yes, that's a very good point. Yes.
Okay. To help himself come to terms with the problems of the superhero in retirement, he seeks out the company of the original Blue Beetle, now an old man, who I don't believe was owned by Charlton.
Hmm.
I think he was a public domain character at that point. Anyway,
Oh, that's interesting.
Dan Garrett. The original Beetle, since his retirement, seems to have adjusted almost perfectly to normal life. He's revealed his identity to the world, written a moderately successful book about his life, and is now the proud and happy owner of a little garage. His autobiography was punningly titled Under the Hood. The new Beetle finds that he has a lot in common with the older man, and by reading his book, discovers that many of the problems that the old man talks about are the ones that he is facing 20 years or so earlier. 20 years or so later. The two become fast friends. And even though this doesn't immediately solve all of the new Beetle's problems, it does give him someone to talk to again. I say again because while the Blue Beetle used to be pretty close friends with the Question, the relationship has cooled and changed in the time since we last saw them. Oh yeah, because they were a team in the Charlton
Mm.
comics. They're even a team in Crisis on Infinite Earths.
Yes, yeah.
Blue Beetle and the Question. For one thing, the Blue Beetle has started to mellow politically as he grows older and can no longer feel quite as comfortable as he once did with the Question's own brand of intense, extreme morality. With the Question, however, it's all or nothing, and as a result, the two haven't seen each other in years. In fact, nobody has seen the Question to talk to in years, but I'll save that for the next section. Suffice it to say that when our story opens, the Blue Beetle, now retired, divides his time between his work, his enthusiastic conversations with the original Blue Beetle, and a lot of time just sitting morosely in his underground hangar, looking at his huge aircraft, the Bug, as it stands there turning from blue to gray with a gradual accumulation of dust that it has gathered during its disuse. He's a man with a lot on his mind, but that's where we'll leave him for the moment as we move on to his partner in crime fighting as was.
So what I was thinking reading that about, he was talking about the Question, and again about how Alan Moore is viewed by people. And I've been guilty of this myself, of viewing Alan Moore as this. Like, Alan Moore is seen as this sort of Steve Ditko figure now, isn't he? This sort of
Yes.
uncompromising, cutting his nose off to spite his face kind of guy. And he's not that at all. Like, Watchmen is a critique of that worldview, is a critique of Ditko's politics. And it's interesting that just, Alan Moore, I think he's a guy who just basically he doesn't want to get screwed over. He doesn't want to get exploited. Um, he's got some self-respect about him, and he doesn't want to get taken advantage of. And he just wants to be a good guy as well. That's certainly an impression I get from what I've read about him and his situation. But just being that is enough to paint you as this radical Ditko-like figure, objectivist figure,
I think it baffles a lot of people the idea that Alan Moore is this avant-garde artist
Yeah,
versus the idea that Alan Moore is a dude who wants to get paid for
yeah,
work that he did.
absolutely.
These two things are not mutually exclusive,
Yeah.
but somehow we like to think it is.
Yeah.
Art shouldn't be commercial.
Yeah. But I've been guilty of viewing him that way, as this sort of cranky old, difficult person. But he's not, is he? He just wants a fair deal, like anyone.
Well, I do think that maybe at first, I was very defensive of him, saying that, oh yeah, he's just exaggerating, he's just taking the piss, making fun, etc. But I also do think that if after at least at this point 20 years of telling journalists stop asking me about Watchmen and The Killing Joke, and
Yeah.
even after 20 years of journalists being like, how do you look back on Watchmen and The Killing Joke?
Yeah.
You know what? I'd be grumpy too.
Yeah, I mean, like, because we see him as this guy who's always like, Watchmen, but he's not. It's just that's the windows of time in which we see him is when he's being asked about Watchmen directly. So, of course, we see that side of him, but he's not like sitting on his couch at home going, Watchmen.
After he's blatantly asked them to stop talking about it.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there is a lot of stuff there about about how he probably could have handled his business better. I'm not the person to be talking about that. Maybe bridges were burned. I don't know.
Mm.
But you know, it's just from as somebody who interviews artists and writers, if they ask me not to talk about something, guess what
Mm.
I'm gonna do? Not talk
Mm.
about that thing because it's the polite thing to do.
Yeah, I think when you're interviewing comics writers about their comics work, it's like it'd be different if you were like Larry King or something interviewing a politician or something,
No, a
But
journalist's
really,
job is to
yeah,
hold, like, when it comes to the government, is to hold the
mm,
government accountable. That's
yeah,
right. Like, I'll ask the hard hitting questions, sure. But these are freaking comic books.
yeah, exactly, yeah,
We're reading them for fun,
yeah.
and we should talk about them for fun. And when the
Mm,
person you're talking to is no longer finding it fun, stop talking to them about it.
yeah, absolutely, yeah.
All right. Let's read the Night Owl revisions. You can take these.
The Night Owl. The Night Owl substitutes for the Blue Beetle and is a sort of composite of a certain type of superhero, taking in Batman, Moon Knight, the Green Hornet, and other notables along the way. He has a huge underground hideout and a massive owl-like flying ship, possibly including other superhero trappings like a car or a speedboat. The nighttime environment he operates in will have touches of Eisner about it, but otherwise this character is the nearest we get to a conventional superhero. The original Night Owl. Obviously, this character substitutes for the original Blue Beetle, a hero in retirement living off his memories. What me and Dave want to do here is to create a whole previous continuity for this world that will maybe only be alluded to in specific detail once or twice in passing. If we get to see the original Night Owl's trophy room, there'll be a large framed photograph of Night Owl sitting in on the historical meeting of this world's first super team of the 1940s, the Minutemen. We see trophies relating to villains he has fought in the past and stuff like that. Just as if we were picking up the threads of a comic line discontinued in the 60s, the details of which we expect the reader to be familiar with. The original Night Owl will enable us to introduce some of this background material naturally, as well as allowing us to study the superhero in his twilight years.
So, two things about that. Talking about the Eisner influence on Night Owl, right? And I mentioned earlier about the Mad influence. I think Watchmen is very notable for being influenced by a lot of artists, including Harvey Kurtzman from Mad and Will Eisner. And one of those artists is not Jack Kirby.
Mm.
Right? Which I think is also because like Watchmen is a very subdued and it's not like in your face. It's not an in your face comic, but I think it also goes to the influence of Jack Kirby in the sense that it actively tried to avoid him.
Mm. Mm. Yeah.
The other thing that I want to point out is the idea that we're picking up the threads of a comic line discontinued in the 60s. It reminds me of, and they'll hate me when they hear this, Grant Morrison's Club of Heroes.
Yeah.
Where they reintroduce a bunch of characters that we haven't seen since the 50s, and we're just peppered with a lot of details and a lot of styles about how, like, oh yeah, these guys have kept having their own adventures. I
Yeah.
love when they do that.
Mm. Mm.
I love when they do that. Like Bobo Benetti.
Yeah.
Like, Bobo Benetti was a completely new character in Starman, and somehow they convinced me that he was an existing Golden Age character. Brilliant.
Yeah. It's all there as well, isn't it? The original Night Owl. That's Hollis Mason. Even Under the Hood is exactly the same title.
Exactly, yeah. It's
Mm.
exactly the same thing. Um, I'll point out that the design for original Night Owl is a character that Dave Gibbons came up with when he was a kid.
Really? Oh, wow.
Yes, I believe he's even called Night Owl.
Oh, cool.
So he just used that design for Hollis Mason's Night Owl.
That's lovely.
Obviously, um, Dan, Dan's what is that? Dan
Right.
Dryberg's costume is influenced very heavily by Batman,
Mm,
right? Not the Blue Beetle, it's by Batman.
yeah, yeah. I suppose you've got like he specifically mentions Moon Knight there as well, doesn't he? And you've got a bit of that in it as well, haven't you?
Yeah, the cape, like
Yeah,
instead of a
yeah,
moon, it's gonna show up like an owl.
yeah, yeah.
And I love the mention of the Green Hornet just because. Shout
Yeah.
out. All right. The question.
Oh,
Here we go. When all the superheroes retired in 1977, the question was the only exception. The question is not the slightest bit concerned with the law. He is concerned with truth and morality. And if that means breaking corrupt laws that only exist because of the actions of dissident pressure groups and minorities, wow, then he will break them without thinking about it. Not, however, without consequence. The question is currently wanted by the police on numerous charges, including 7 counts of murder. The way I see the question, he is such an extreme character that even hardline right wingers would feel nervous about his attitudes and actions. The thing is, in order to present the character fairly, I will have to make those views completely logical and heartfelt so as not to present him as a parody of right wing attitudes as seen by a left winger. Depending on which way you look at him, the question is either the one incorruptible force at large in a world of eroded morals and values, or he is a dangerous and near psychotic sociopath who kills without compassion or regard for legal niceties. Oh, wow.
do you think he did his job a bit too well there? You know, like he made Rorschach a bit too appealing to certain right wing people.
I think at the risk of making the worst pun I've ever made, Rorschach is a Rorschach test.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
It's just
yeah.
however you see Rorschach is basically how you see yourself.
Mm,
And it's just, I do think that he made him a little too, because the whole thing about Rorschach is his integrity, and people really respond to that kind of integrity. The whole like I'm gonna hold fast to my principles type of thing.
mm,
But it's just there's times you do that. It's a pick your battles, people. Like there's times you do
mm.
that, and there's times that like you're actually hurting people if you do that.
Well, I mean, this is my personal worldview again. I mean, principles are important and integrity is important, but it gets to a point where, like, it's just dogma. It's just dogmatic, and you've got to have this flexibility. You've got to be able to take the world as you find it, not as how you wish it to be.
Yeah,
And it is
definitely.
very. I think it's a very immature view of the world, and it's a very safe view of the world in a way. It's like I've got a rule book, and I can follow this rule book no matter what, and the world can't touch me, and I know I'm doing the right thing if I'm following this rule book. And
It
there is no rule book that you can follow where you will 100% always be doing the right thing because that's not how the world works.
and like just it presupposes that nothing changes, that like the
Yeah,
world will never change,
yeah,
there's
yeah,
no
yeah,
adjustments to be made or whatever, like
yeah,
you just, and the fact that a lot of people walk away from Watchmen thinking that Rorschach is the hero, it
yeah,
just makes me think, go out and hang out with some people.
yeah, yeah, yeah. But yeah, if you're following a rule book, if you're following, these cast iron principles, you never have to think for yourself. You never have to ask yourself hard questions, you know? And you can
No,
still say, I'm a good guy because I followed these rules.
and there is no rule book that in itself isn't so big that it doesn't contradict itself.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I think we all know what I'm talking about.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
There, there is one law, people, which is to love and be kind to each other.
Yep. Do unto others as you would have them do it to you.
Do you know? Have you heard of Steve Ditko's character, Mr. A?
Yes.
So Steve Ditko's character, Mr. A, is like the question, only more extreme. So even as we were talking earlier about Steve Ditko's question having all of these didactic dialogue balloons, Mr. A is worse.
Yeah, so
um,
it
so Mr. A is worse. Mr. A's calling card, Mr. A's symbol is a calling card with like half black and half white. And then he'll be like, there's no gray in here, which is, of course, because you used a fucking marker. And with that, that's actually where Rorschach mostly comes from. It's more from Mr. A than the question.
Yeah.
And then later on, when Moore talks to Steve Ditko about about the question, he'll be like, about Rorschach, he'll be like, have you heard of my character Rorschach? And Steve Ditko went, oh yeah, he's like Mr. A, only insane. Anyway,
where are we? Legal niceties, was that the last?
I just want to point out that I saw a steep drop in our viewership right after we were talking about the rule book.
Oh.
So so I just think that's really funny. Okay.
Oh no. We've just alienated everyone. Sorry.
Cancel Cube.
Yeah. Sorry, was regard for legal niceties, was that the last sentence we had?
Yes.
Cool. I suppose what I want to do with the character is to keep him as true as possible to the quintessential Steve Ditko character and philosophy. Now, while I've always found Steve Ditko's expressed political opinions to be strange and possibly dangerous, no. I have a
Really?
huge amount of admiration for anybody who is prepared to take an unpopular position simply because they happen to believe it's morally right.
No.
Morals today are at a premium, whether you happen to agree with them or not. On top of this, I have the greatest possible regard for Steve Ditko as an artist and creator and wouldn't want to portray his characters falsely or inaccurately.
I think morals today are not a premium. I think everyone today is like all about their own morals.
Yeah, no, I disagree with Moore a bit there in that, although I understand where he's coming from. It's like I don't admire that worldview anymore for the reasons I just described.
Yeah.
I want people who are more flexible, especially people in charge who are a bit more flexible, you know?
It's true.
Yeah. But the question, on the one hand, is an obsessed character. He will do absolutely anything in pursuit of his own rigid moral code, save contradict his own beliefs. If necessary, he will kill. And 5 of the 7 counts of murder, at least, are fully justified from a legal point of view. Having been more or less driven underground by the anti-superhero movements in the mid-70s, he works completely alone and without companionship of any sort, which leads to his attitudes becoming even more deeply entrenched and intensified. I'm just going to finish this, I guess, now, because
good.
He is implacable, ruthless, and quite unpredictable. He may even be mad, according to some theorists. He stalks the night streets of this shadowy and paranoid world, carrying out his own grim and personal vendetta against all that is evil and wrong, wherever it tries to conceal itself. And he is a complete wild card, quirky and unpredictable in the extreme. This becomes significant later in the story, but for the moment, we'll leave it there. The question is still active in fighting crime and corruption, even though he now has to do it while on the run from the authorities himself. He has no friends to speak of, having given up on the Blue Beetle in disgust when he saw what a wimpy, self-defeating specimen his former friend had started to turn into. It is the question who kicks the whole story off and starts it moving when he is called upon to investigate a murder. This brings us neatly to our last couple of characters.
It's weird that it says that he's called upon to investigate a murder when he is breaking the law by staying active.
Yeah.
And he is wanted by the police.
I wonder if that was just a figure of speech or if he really did intend for someone to be giving Rorschach missions originally or something.
Yeah. Or maybe he's working with the police, with somebody in the police.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just resisting this idea of like not wanting to, wanting to be respectful to the characters that Steve Ditko created. I mean, on the one hand, it's kind of like, is he respectful because Rorschach's such an over-the-top parody? But on the other hand, it's like, well, that's kind of how the Question and Mr. A were, isn't it? You know, that they were like kind of ridiculous. You know? And I know I'm being quite disrespectful to Ditko and his beliefs here, but I just think those beliefs are so stupid to me. You know, this is me personally talking here. You know,
I mean, we're talking like Ayn Randian objectivist philosophies here, and there's two ways you can go about this. One is you go with what Moore did, or to a lesser extent with what Justice League Unlimited did, which is still like that's about as faithful to the Ditko stuff as you can get, and he still looked ridiculous, which was fun.
Yeah.
You know, juxtaposed next to other characters, it was actually really fun. But at the same time, the other way to go about it is what Denny O'Neil and Dennis Cowan did, which is to go in completely the opposite direction and from the start be like, oh yeah, all of this objectivist stuff is wrong. Right? So, I mean, is there a way to even do Ditko's Question seriously in you know, without it being a satire or a parody? I don't think there is, really.
I mean, you'd have to believe it all, wouldn't you? Like Ditko did.
You would have to believe it, and you know, there would be a faction of people who would buy into it. But I personally would think it was dumb.
I'm surprised people aren't doing it, you know, because there are comic fans out there who believe it, who create comics, and is it out there? You know, this kind of modern day Mr. A.
But see, even them, I do think that they do believe in the idea of community, and you know, I don't think. I think in as much as some people are more extreme politically now, I'm not so sure that there's a lot of objectivism. All right. Rorschach is the replacement for the Question and draws his name from the famous psychiatrist's blot test. While he wears an assortment of street clothes rather than a costume, his entire body is encased in a thin, hollow membrane, semi-porous and incredibly thin. This contains two viscous liquids, one black and the other white. The liquids flow and change according to variations in pressure and body temperature, making the black and white blots run over his body in an ever-changing design. His face is a white blank, marked only by a constantly altering Rorschach blot. The black and white motif ties in with the character's very hard-edged moral philosophy and is also used by the character himself as a metaphor for the ambiguity of life. Each man must read his own fate into the pictures conjured by the neutral Rorschach blot and judge himself accordingly. Rorschach's secret identity is unusual. He poses as a placard-toting religious fanatic and lives in a seedy one-room apartment that is a horrific and squalid mess. He eats tinned food cold straight out of the can and only sleeps about 4 hours every night. He's a man on the edge in more respects than one, and his end of the world is nigh placards will take on a more solemn significance as the story progresses and the world in the strip moves closer to all-out thermonuclear war. This is the part where I share this cursed image.
I know
All
the image you're
right.
going to share.
It's not that image, it's this image. Okay. So there is a picture of the original design for the question for Rorschach, which has a trench. It's basically him as like a flasher, isn't it?
I
But
like how, you can see Dr. Manhattan's Willy in that image, and it's still not the most disturbing part of that. There's a guy with his Willy out and a guy in a gimp mask, and your eyes are still drawn to Rorschach.
so the interesting thing to me here is Night Owl and the Comedian pretty much retain those looks, and
Yeah.
Dr. Manhattan. Silk Spectre pretty much has that same look with a different color scheme. I think they wisely did not go with a translucent dress. And
Are his sleeves still translucent though?
yeah, her sleeves, I guess there's kind of translucent, but they're all like they're yellow, right?
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
not
yeah.
like it's not like
Oh,
clear.
yeah.
And Ozymandias is pretty much on model except for his hair, which is longer. But then there's Rorschach, Paul.
Oh, I'm so
What
glad
even is
they
that?
dropped it. I'm so glad they dropped that.
This is a character. This is a character that was derived from the question: a man in a suit and a fedora with no face. And somehow they decided, as an early thing, that this would be his costume.
Amazing. I just
It's
want to say
incredible.
that image as well. It kind of gives the game away about Ozymandias, doesn't it? Because he's basically just sitting there going, "I'm evil, I'm evil."
Well, it's not as much as the movie did, I think,
That's true.
where they flat out give him a German accent, which is
Yeah,
nothing
yeah,
against Germans, but we know what that means in Hollywood, right?
yeah.
But oh my god, that Rorschach design. There is an alternate reality where that is the design that they went with for Rorschach. And who knows how different the world would be
Yeah.
if that happened. All right. Shall we continue with a comedian
Cool.
or a peacemaker?
Peacemaker, yeah.
Oh, wow. This is short. I just want to point out that the peacemaker is dead, or the comedian is dead at the start of the story, and he still gets a part in the proposal before Nightshade and the Silk Spectre.
Yeah.
The peacemaker's you.
Oh, is it me? Oh, lovely.
Yeah.
Peacemaker, like Captain Atom, has been able to continue with his career, albeit in a fairly low-key sort of way, by virtue of the fact that he was working in a government capacity most of the time. Some of his duties included government internal investigation and a little spying here and there. He's led a comparatively quiet sort of life since the 60s, but all that is to change quite suddenly when he happens upon a chance piece of information that leads him to another piece of information that leads him to an absolutely crushing discovery. This discovery leads in turn to Peacemaker's death, which happens in the first 2 or 3 pages of the first issue. It is Peacemaker's death which involves the question, and it is the question's implacable inquiry that starts to open up the can of worms that is our story. I'll get to our story in just a moment, right after I've considered that last member of our lineup. So that's the comedian, basically, isn't it? That's all there.
That's the comedian. I think there's a little bit of Captain America's Secret Empire in there, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like, I can imagine him reading Captain America's Secret Empire in the 70s and thinking, oh, well, this would totally break him.
You know what's really interesting to me is that, and I know they tried to do stuff with Peacemaker, in the Vigilante comic and in other places as well, in Blue Beetle, but they never really, like all the other people we've seen, like Dr. Manhattan fed into later depictions of Captain Atom. Night Owl fed into later depictions of the Blue Beetle, and so on.
Yeah.
Peter Cannon, kind of depictions. Yeah, but like this depiction of Peacemaker, it didn't really result in anything being done with Peacemaker until James Gunn.
And even then, like, it has nothing to do with the comedian.
No, he's like a very and I love James Gunn's version of the Peacemaker, which is the version we get in the comics at the moment. But I really love that. But it's a very broad parody of this kind of character. Like, it's so broad.
The Peacemaker is a character who lends himself to parody because I think his tagline is he loves peace so much he's willing to fight for it.
Yeah.
Or he's willing to kill for it.
Yeah.
I do realize that he says we'll get to our story in just a moment, but the story itself is not in here. So we're not actually going to get to the story. We're just going to go with the characters. Because after going to the characters, he actually publishes the first page of script.
Okay.
Of issue 1. So we're not actually going to get to that. That is regretful. I have one question for you before we go to the comedian revision, which is, do you really want to taste it?
Yes, I do.
All right, the comedian stands in for the Peacemaker, and his is the most radically different of all our new characters to the original. No, he's not. No, he's not. In a more aggressive and militaristic America, such as is depicted in our story, the idea of a peacemaker rings a little ironically. The comedian, on the other hand, is a different kettle of fish. Basically, he's a one-man superhero version of the Dirty Tricks division of the CIA. If an unsympathetic foreign leader needs removing from the field of play, then the comedian will handle the contract. If a communist government needs overthrowing, then the comedian will move into town and set things in motion, using methods similar to those used by the insurrectionist hero of Eric Frank Russell's book, Wasp. Having been most active during the 60s, the comedian is a man of about 50 years old in the present day. He's a Superboy-built athletic specimen with rugged features and black hair that's going white at the temples, as is how you depict age in superhero comics.
Yeah.
He has a massive chest cavity and a frightening display of muscles writhing all over his body, even though the hair on his body is starting to turn gray. Even though he dies after the first page of the first issue of Watchmen, he's quite an important pivotal character, and I think we should design him carefully. As I see him, he'd be the only superhero apart from Dr. Manhattan that Rorschach would have any real respect for, and it may be this that prompts him to investigate the character's death so thoroughly and with such shocking consequences. I've always found it weird that his name is the comedian, and a part of me believes that his name is that so that Moore could make those comedian puns throughout the whole series.
But I guess he's the person who sees how ridiculous it all is, but doesn't care. I guess he's a bit like the Joker in that he can see the joke of it all.
I suppose so, but he is also a member of the Minutemen, and he has that original costume, that little comedian type costume at the start, which is, I guess it's weird that he kept the name the comedian after he became after he became essentially the Winter Soldier.
Yeah. The Winter Soldier with a mustache.
With a mustache and a big scar.
It's interesting, this idea of him being a sort of one-man CIA, because that's such a big part of 20th century history, isn't it? Is that America doing shady stuff around the world.
That is correct. It's all about overthrowing the communists.
Yeah.
Interesting. All right. I guess we're finishing with Nightshade. Oh no, there's the Minutemen after this.
Yeah.
Okay.
Nightshade. I've saved this one to last, mainly because she's the one I know least about and have the least ideas on. Oh, Alan.
Oh, Alan.
As the only woman character, she is obviously very important, as well as being important to the story, in that she is just about Captain Atom's only emotional link to the world. How she fits in exactly, I haven't quite decided yet. But I see at least part of her purpose being to expand upon the concept of superhero sexuality, if only in a subdued and oblique sense. The way I see it, the sexual morality of superhumans would be different and less restricted and restrained than that of normal humans, which could lead to some interesting character interactions. However, other than the fact that she'd be useful as someone to draw Captain Atom out of himself at the appropriate point in the story, I don't have a lot planned for her presence. Thus, her presence in the following story outline may seem a little tentative at best. Please be assured that once I've had a chance to research her character properly, she'll be as fleshed out as all the rest. The only real comment I think I could make at this stage is that I think perhaps her costume and hairstyle could do with redesigning to bring her into the 80s. It's only a personal thing, but I always found the ponytail and the fly-like eyes to be pretty repellent. Although that's just a matter of individual taste, I suppose. While on the subject of costumes, how do you feel about Captain Atom returning to his original Golden Age costume? Although the later costume looked great in itself, I always liked the first one better. It's no big deal if you'd rather keep it in the blue and silver design, but if I had to choose myself, I'd go for the golden outfit as being the more distinctive and stylish of the two. Or you
I
could
have
just have
nothing to say to this.
Oh
I have
dear.
as much to say about this as he did about Nightshade.
I mean, does he really flesh her out in the sense that he's just, she is a way to draw Captain Atom out of, or Dr. Manhattan out of himself in the book. I mean, you've got that story of her and her mother, but that's all, about her father, isn't it? It's about the comedian as
About the
well.
comedian, yeah. She's the one who's connected to everyone, I think,
Yeah,
is the thing. She is
all the men.
she's the only woman.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
Isn't she? Yeah, yeah.
so she's the one who does have a connection to everyone. Well, no, she doesn't even have a connection to Adrian and to Rorschach.
Mm.
So that's not even true. But she does in the defense of that, though, she is the reason that the story goes the way it goes.
Yeah, like you couldn't tell this story without her.
No, like you couldn't tell the story without any of them, but
Yeah,
you couldn't drive this story without her.
yeah, yeah,
She is, whether or not the character intends to drive the story, she is the one driving the story.
yeah, yeah.
She's the one reacting to things, and making it so that Dan can become a superhero again, so that Doc Manhattan can decide to save Earth and
Yeah.
whatnot. Uh, I I just think it's a little cheap, I guess.
Mm, mm.
That the only female character that we have, and the only comment we have is that we will use her to explore the concept of superhero sexuality.
Mm.
Superhero sexuality in Watchmen is most defined by Dan Dryberg
Yeah, yeah.
more than anyone else. But if you take a look at the audience for superhero comics, I suppose the Silk Spectre is the character that you would look at and be like, "Oh yeah, she's sexy."
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I do think that he does find kind of a voice for her by replacing Nightshade with another Golden Age character.
Yeah.
All right, replacing Nightshade, Silk Spectre is another second generation superhero similar to the new Night Owl. Her mother, the original Silk Spectre, was a member of the Minutemen along with the old Night Owl back in the 1940s. A fiercely independent woman, the original Silk Spectre had not been fortunate enough to be married to a man flexible enough to adjust to the idea of having a superheroine for a wife. This led to the breakdown of what had previously been a happy marriage, and Silk Spectre was forced to bring up her daughter, born in 1950, all on her own. This more or less forced her to give up superheroing and get a proper job. She has since remarried and become re-widowed and currently lives on her own somewhere on the west coast of America. Whether intentionally or not, She has more or less forced her daughter into a career as a superhero in order to compensate for her own career, cut short by motherhood. As our story opens, the new Silk Spectre is 35 years old. Her lover, Doc Manhattan, appears to be withdrawing into a subquantum limbo, and she's starting to take a long, hard look at herself as a superhero and as a woman. So basically, he replaced Nightshade with a Black Canary.
Well, you say that. I don't think he did really, because all that stuff about Black Canary's mother and being the original Black Canary and our Black Canary being her daughter, that comes much later, doesn't it?
Much later. That's wait.
Because
so I think the retcon happened before Watchmen.
It did, but the way they did the retcon in the pages of Justice League in the early 80s was that it was not a great retcon.
Which is one of the worst retcons ever done.
Yeah, what is it? You'll have to remind me. Is it the brain of the mother is in the daughter's body? Is that right?
I think it was more that a spell was cast so that the daughter believed she was the mother.
That's so weird. Not
either way.
Yeah.
Either way, it's weird.
Yeah.
What are you saying? Are you saying that like the Black Canary's dynamic was changed because of Watchmen?
I think so, because you've got a story that pops up in Secret Origins then in the late 80s.
Yes.
I think it's in Secret Origins number 50. I might be wrong though. But I think that shows the death of the original Black Canary of old age. And you have the Black Canary Jr. then talking about her relationship with her mother. And then I think Wade expanded on it more in stuff like JLA Year One about, and even before that, maybe there was a Secret Origins story as well of the original Justice League, where you've almost got this Black Canary being pressured by her mother into being Black Canary.
Yes.
Like the original Black Canary is trying to live vicariously through her daughter, and that she's friends with all the Golden Age heroes. I think that's something Wade brought into it in JLA Year One.
Yes, like she's always bringing up her uncles.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And that's all from Watchmen, isn't it? That's all from Silk Spectre, I think.
I suppose so. I guess that's true.
Yeah.
Well, we also find out later on that the original Black Canary, the original Starman, had an affair.
Yeah.
Which Jack Knight would find out about. Did he ever talk to Dinah about it? I don't think there was ever a scene.
I don't think so, no.
Seems
because
like
Starman and Black Canary used to team up in the 60s, didn't they? Quite a lot.
Yes, it was a very random team up.
Yeah.
Somebody just really liked writing Starman and the Black Canary together. Okay.
Yeah, there we go.
We have the Minutemen left, so we got 2 pages left. We're about to wrap up, everyone. So, you want to go with this one?
Yeah, brilliant. Anyway, enough of character outlines. There will, of course, be other characters making minor appearances in the strip, including a few old villains and each character's supporting cast. But other than that, we've covered the main ones, I think. Depending on exactly what rights you own, it might be nice to have a couple of other Charlton characters turning up in cameo roles. Sarge Steele, the Fighting Five, or even a now grown-up Tiger wearing the uniform of his former mentor, Judo Master. None of these are strictly necessary, although Tiger might be fun. I thought it might be nice to drop in a few familiar faces for old Charlton fans, as long as we could do it without getting in the way of the story.
All right.
The minute.
Oh, God, yeah, go sorry. Ahead. We can switch.
Yeah. This group of 40s superheroes are alluded to in the past tense throughout the story as a symbol of simpler, happier times. Their name also provides a sort of ironic counterpoint to the book's title Watchmen. I'll give a brief rundown of them here so that Dave has something to think about while he's designing the main characters. So I'm just going to stop there because I just want to bring up something like a misconception that a lot of people do. Like, they were never called the Watchmen, were they?
No, never.
In the story. And people talk about them like they were.
Like they were a super team. Yeah. The Watchmen.
But they were never called the Watchmen.
No, they were almost called the Crime Busters.
Yeah, and I think that kind of sums up the very reductive way that a lot of people few Watchmen, including
Yes.
DC. You know.
Just like there is an undercurrent. There's so much going on in Watchmen that
Yeah.
whenever people say things like whenever people say things like, "Oh yeah, Watchmen, like its greatest accomplishment is making people see superheroes in a new light." Like,
Mm.
I'm not so sure that's its greatest accomplishment.
No, no.
No. There's so much going. It wouldn't have remained timeless if that was it,
Mm. Yeah,
because
absolutely.
everything else after that has built on it, on that aspect of it. It wouldn't have remained timeless if that was it. It remains timeless because of so many other things, like the commentary on the real world, just the sheer technical execution of the storytelling. Uh, but yeah, I do think that there is a surface level reading the Watchmen that a lot of people you would go for, and that is the type of surface level reading that would lead to people just calling them the Watchmen.
Yeah. And this is
Which,
it.
if that's how you enjoy the book, then fine, go ahead.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But I think, this is what we as, and I include myself in this because I do it as well. Like superhero fans and a lot of superhero creators can't see outside superhero comics
No,
and don't want to talk about things outside superhero comics. And I do that. I'm like
guilty,
that. Yeah.
guilty.
So
Like,
yeah.
I read a lot of other comics and I read a lot of other stuff, but it's just when you're talking about superhero comics, because of its history and the fact that every character has been written by like 59 different people over the last 70 years, there's just so much to talk about, comparisons to be made, and sadly, mistakes that we
Mm.
perceive that need to be fixed, that we
Yeah.
are so brilliant that only we have seen those mistakes and know how to fix them.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think that Moore wanted to say something about the real world using superheroes, and a lot of people who read Watchmen only see the superheroes.
Mm.
And
Absolutely.
again, guilty. I have done that. But I've
Me too.
but I've read Watchmen like 10 times. So
Yeah.
all right. Lineup circa 1944. The original Night Owl. As described above, the original Night Owl began his career in 1940, aged 24 years old. He was born 1916, because that's how math works. And by the time our present continuity rolls around, he is 69 nice years old. He was acting president of the Minutemen for most of their adventures, handing the responsibility over to one of his fellow members as the result of his absence. Nothing much to say there.
Yeah.
The original Silk Spectre, very much in the tradition of the original Phantom Lady. Well, Alan Moore really likes the Phantom Lady.
Yeah.
See you, Lamar. Lamar says bye.
Oh, bye.
The Silk Spectre was voluptuous to the extreme and even had the honor of appearing in her own brief line of pornographic Tijuana Bibles, along with such other real life notables as Mae West. Hey, Paul, how do you know when a man is writing a woman?
Don't know. Go on. Voluptuous.
That entire paragraph.
Yeah.
Born in 1926, she took up her secret identity in 1942, age 18. In later years, she confessed that this was because she had a crush on an obscure, then popular superhero who called himself Hooded Justice. And by the time she had learned on the superhero gossip grapevine that he was in fact, again, I am reading these words as they were written in 1986. That he was, by the time she had learned on the superhero gossip grapevine that he was in fact a well-known gay sadomasochist, she was too deeply involved to extricate herself. Although in her early career she used a number of tricky scientific weapons based upon her knowledge of chemistry, she abandoned these when a preparation blew up, badly burning one hand. After this point, she wore a single glove to conceal her admittedly slight disfigurement. Most people took it as further erotic enhancement to her costume rather than the concealment of a blemish, and she became more popular than ever. A famous moment in her career came when Underworld czar Jimmy Fantucci gave himself up to police rather than shoot her. I feel like a lot of that isn't actually shown.
I don't think the glove thing is it? Is it a passing reference to a crime lord giving himself up rather than shooting it, like maybe like a headline or something?
Um, I if somewhere in the back,
Yeah, maybe.
I don't think so. Most of the stuff in the back is about her relationship with Hooded Justice,
Mm.
including a headline that says "Villains vie for voluptuous vigilante."
It's interesting,
Uh,
isn't it, that people kind of read into Watchmen that there's a couple you can see in the background, isn't there? In one scene, that it's like two older men enjoying each
yes,
other, and people view
Watchmen
that
number
as
one.
like, yeah, like Hooded Justice isn't, is it Captain Metropolis or someone
Hooded
else? Yeah,
Justice and Captain Metropolis
yeah, and like,
are
but that's not how Alan Moore saw, Hooded Justice's identity, is it?
no, no, it's not. But I have talked to Dave Gibbons about that,
Mm.
and he did say that it wasn't their intention, but he's claiming it.
Oh, that's not. Oh, there we go. That's canon. Then there we go.
It's like, all right, we're just gonna run with it. No, I just flipped through it, and even in civilian scenes, Sally's hand is completely uncovered. So
Mm.
that hand thing never happened
And
in the
then the
story.
chemical thing never happens
The
either, does it?
chemical thing. I never see any. I don't remember any incidents of Sally being a chemical genius.
Mm.
Uh, and if I'm right, that skirt is very short in this original design.
Yeah, the Tijuana Bibles turn up though, don't they?
They do turn up.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that is something, as much as we make fun of it, I do think that's something that is true to life. Like, if superheroes came out right now, there would be porn of them.
Mm. Yeah,
That's just rule
absolutely.
34. Like, it would happen.
Mm.
And they would have to deal with that. All right,
Um,
brother.
Brother Knight, a real weirdie, similar in visual look to the Spectre or Mr. Justice, or some of those grotesque, timely characters like the Destroyer or the Vision. Nobody ever figured out whether he really had the supernatural abilities he claimed to have, but they seemed pretty convincing at the time. He vanished from mortal gaze in 1951 and has not been heard of since. That never happened, did it, in Watchmen? There's no Brother Knight, is there?
I think he's supposed to be Hooded Justice because Hooded Justice is nowhere here.
Ah, yeah, that makes sense. I'll just do,
But
yeah.
I don't understand how. Yeah, so that didn't happen. That's not how Hooded Justice was, but I think he's supposed to be Hooded Justice. Yeah, you
Okay,
can do Dollar Bill and the Comedian.
yeah. Dollar Bill, a rather simple-minded, patriotic superhero born in the Farm Belt, became a superhero in 1940, aged 25, was shot dead during a bank raid in 1946.
That's
The
easy enough.
comedian, yeah, that's kind of, yeah. But he did the Cape gag with Dollar
He
Bill,
did
of
the
course, before The Incredibles.
before the Incredibles did.
Yeah, the comedian
Funny
before
thing is,
being
he didn't even have the longest cape. Hooded Justice has the longest cape.
yeah. The comedian, before being grabbed by the government for official dirty work, the comedian played a vicious and effective trade in fighting the denizens of New York's underworld. He was the youngest masked adventurer of the 40s, being born in 1928 and joining the Minutemen at the tender age of 16. The same year, he took up his dual identity.
Does he look like a comedian to you? Like, even this original costume?
Well, he's just got like the clown thing going on, I guess.
I guess so.
Because you can see how Dave Gibbons has drawn him there. He's got that sort of Krusty the Clown kind of thing, which I don't think stays with the character. I don't know.
No, it
I just want
doesn't.
to talk about at this point, because I think it's worth bringing up, even though I think we've discussed it before in other ones, is that there actually were real life superheroes, weren't there, about 10 or 15 years ago?
Yes.
Um,
Yes, I remember them.
yeah. And I think I've mentioned this article before on one of our talks, but I'll mention it again because it's so interesting and relevant to what we're saying. There's a John Ronson interview with Phoenix Jones, one of these real life superheroes. Yeah, that's really worth tracking down and having a read of, because it's just interesting to see, like, real life superheroes has happened, and the little detail, like John Ronson's wonderful giving us these little details and not commenting on them, but just saying so much that you're leaving them to say so much on their own. The detail of, like, Phoenix Jones had a grappling hook that he used to climb to the top of a building. And then when he got to the top of the building, he realized there's nothing up here.
There's nothing here.
I'm just standing on a roof. There's no criminals up here. There's nothing. Like, I'm useless up here. And so he stopped doing it. He stopped bringing out his grappling hook. And I just love that detail. It's so wonderful.
It's not like that's how criminals used to get up there.
Yeah.
But yeah, I remember those real life superheroes and thinking, like, and I remember some people saying that, oh yeah, that's awesome. It's like comics come to life. And I was like, I don't want comics to come to life.
Yeah. And of course they didn't do anything. There's this interview, it described, because, like, John Ronson follows them around for an evening, and they have this really awkward standoff with some drug dealers. And it's really awkward and scary, because at the end it's obvious that the drug dealers just find them too ridiculous to kill, basically. And they don't accomplish anything, bless them,
Oh my God. All right. Mothman. A playboy adventurer who donned a splendidly bizarre moth suit to fight crime, lending him the ability to glide for short distances, carried a brutally powerful handgun as part of his arsenal, and used it unsparingly. He began his career in 1943, aged 28 years old. He died at the age of 50 in 1962 after retiring in 1955, diagnosed cause of death being cirrhosis of the liver. I feel like this is a riff on the Archie superhero, The Fly.
Yeah.
Captain Metropolis, a vaguely militaristic urban superhero who waged a war against crime, aided by a vast array of gadgets in a master tactician's mind. One of the most respected of the war period superheroes, he took up his career in 1940, aged 25. He remained active until 1965, at which point he retired. He was killed in a car accident in 1972. Of course, that would be a character that would be way more developed by the end of Watchmen.
Yeah.
You want to close this out?
Okay, let's do the Silhouette. Along with the Silk Spectre, the Silhouette was the only other female crime fighter appearing in this comic. No. It was the only other female crime fighter of the period.
At least there were two in that period.
Yeah, yes. A very strange European woman with a temperament similar to Marlene Dietrich or Nico. Silhouette was the only superhero ever to publicly admit to being a homosexual. She lived with a much older woman, a sculptor. She began her career in 1941, aged 27. In 1945, she confessed that she lived with another woman and was immediately asked to resign from the Minutemen. Her confession met with overt hostility from the public, and she was forced to retire in the late autumn of 1945. In 1947, one of her old enemies tracked her down to the address at which she was living under an assumed name with her love and shot both of them dead, mutilating both bodies after death. Ugh.
Well, that's not a really good showing, is it?
No.
Oh my goodness. What do you think of that? Of all of that? Like, now that we've seen the original characters and how, the original plan for these characters, like, so what do you think is the difference between the original plan versus the final product? What is the gulf between conception and execution, do you think?
It's just details, really, isn't it? I mean, it's all there. Even with the Charlton heroes, the meat of it is there.
All of it.
Yeah.
All of it is right there.
Um, I do think there's a few things that they could have changed, and then it would have completely not been the same. So just honestly, like if we'd kept with the Charlton heroes, I just don't think it would be the same. Even
No.
if you retained so much of the same texture, I think the fact, and I don't usually say this, but I think the fact that these characters would have existed beforehand and would have continued to exist afterwards would have ruined it. I think it is very important that this was a one-off.
Yeah, because you would have got, that's Earth 4 or whatever, or that's, there, and you would have had crossovers much sooner. And I think it would have diluted it to a certain extent, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. I think that the moment, I think so much of the power of Watchmen was that it was the one thing that DC had that it just really left alone. Like you couldn't touch it for like a really long time. And then when they finally did touch it, guess what? You put an all-star cast on it, no one still cared.
Yeah, yeah.
And then the one that people do care about, people don't really like it as a Watchmen story.
No,
People like
no.
it as a Superman crisis type story.
Not even we like it as a Watchmen. I mean, we, I think I speak for us both to say we quite like it, don't we? But not as a Watchmen story.
No, it's a Jeff Johns, Gary Frank Superman story about how Superman is awesome.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Because
it's
as a
so
Watchmen,
far from what Watchmen is,
as a Watchmen story, it doesn't do anything. It's one of
No.
those things. It doesn't say anything about the real world,
No.
which is what Watchmen is all about.
Yeah.
I do think that, unfortunate as it may be, again, Alan Moore never did intend for this thing to be read out loud by two people on the internet 40 years from now.
Yeah.
And published in a hardback edition. But I do believe that his views on homosexuality probably evolved, and he understood that they're not masochists, all masochists.
Yeah, and that there are stories you can do about gay people that isn't just about how they're victims, or that aren't tragedies,
Yeah. And
but that's where pop culture was then, wasn't it? It was we've moved on there. It wasn't just Alan Moore doing it.
It's true.
That's how people wrote stories back then, and that's not me excusing it, but it's just
it's what we knew, or it's what we knew, and it was also it's just this is what people thought it was like when people didn't have access to everything. Right now, if I wanted to know how to write, I don't know, like let's say if I wanted to know how to write somebody from India, I could theoretically do all my research without leaving this chair. Right? Yeah. I just talked to a bunch of people. I'd watch a lot of, I'd watch a lot of documentaries or whatever. I'd read a lot of stuff about it. I do a lot of desk research. I would never have to leave this chair. But back then, if you're living in Northampton, England, and you're not leaving Northampton, England, your research is based on what you know.
Yeah.
So this was fun, Paul.
Yeah, I enjoyed it, definitely. Yeah.
We took 3 hours and 17 minutes to read all of that.
Do you know what? There's 7-hour videos on YouTube. I think they're okay.
Which is still half the time it took us to read Twilight of the Superheroes.
There we go. Yeah.
I'm gonna do one more plug one more time. Watching Time, the unauthorized Watchmen chronology, which is by our friend Rich Handley. It's got a foreword by Brian Cronin of Comic Book Resources, back when Comic Book Resources was good, and an essay by me to close off the book. And Alan Moore, Portraits of an Extraordinary Gentleman, compiled by a guy named Smoky Man. It's got literal portraits of Alan. And
wow.
For Alan Moore's 70th birthday. It's got contributors such as Gene Ha, Xander Cannon, Hilary Barta, Paul Gravett, Peter Hogan, and me.
So
Hey,
I will, both of those are on the live chat. So please take the time if you would like to purchase a copy of both books. Thanks so much, Wall. This was awesome as always.
thank you very much, Tar. Thank you.
And we are no longer live.
Well,